More than 3,000 years ago, long before the rise of classical Greece or Rome, a powerful kingdom ruled the rugged heart of Anatolia. Its armies crossed mountains, its kings negotiated with pharaohs, and its scribes recorded laws and treaties that would shape the idea of international diplomacy. Yet, for centuries, this civilization was forgotten, its name erased from memory until the late 19th century, when archaeologists began unearthing clues to a vanished empire, the Hittites. This is the story of how the Hittites rose from small city-states to forge an empire, how they managed their vast domain through diplomacy and faith, and how, at their height, they stood shoulder to shoulder with Egypt in shaping the Bronze Age world. Long before the rise of the Hittite Empire, the land we now call Turkey was already a crossroads of peoples, languages, and trade. In the early centuries of the second millennium BCE, central Anatolia was home to the Hattians, an indigenous people who built walled towns and practiced a rich nature-centered religion. Their world was one of small kingdoms, competing and trading across the high plateaus and river valleys that formed the heart of Anatolia. These early societies laid the political, cultural, and technological groundwork upon which the Hittites would later build their empire. The Hattians spoke a non-Indo-European language, unrelated to the Hittite tongue that would later dominate the region. Their city of Hattusa, perched on a high ridge in north-central Anatolia, was already an important settlement, centuries before it became the Hittite capital. Archaeological evidence shows that the Hattians constructed complex temples, stored grain in large subterranean silos, and left behind impressive stone fortifications. They worshipped a pantheon of local deities tied to natural forces, the storm god, the sun goddess, and numerous river and mountain spirits. Each city had its own divine patrons, and religious rituals were deeply tied to the fertility of the land. The Hattian world, however, did not exist in isolation. To the southeast lay Mesopotamia, with its powerful city-states and long-established systems of trade and writing. Around the 19th century BCE, Assyrian merchants from northern Mesopotamia began to establish trading colonies across Anatolia. These colonies, known by the Akkadian term karum, meaning port or trading quarter, were placed near existing Anatolian cities. The most important of these was the Karum at Kadesh, a site known today as Kultepe, located near modern Kayseri. The Assyrian merchants brought with them not only goods, but also literacy. They used cuneiform script written on clay tablets, creating the first written records in Anatolia. These tablets, many of which have been discovered at Kultepe, offer a remarkable window into the daily life, commerce, and law of the period. They describe contracts, loans, marriage agreements, and even disputes that reached across cultural boundaries. In their texts, we see Anatolian names alongside Assyrian ones, suggesting a level of coexistence and exchange that went beyond trade. The goods exchanged through these networks were valuable and wide-ranging. Assyrian traders brought tin from the east, vital for producing bronze, and fine textiles, while Anatolian merchants supplied silver, copper, and wool. Caravans traveled across the rough terrain of Anatolia, connecting remote mountain towns with the broader world of the Near East. The profits were significant, but so were the risks. Bandit attacks, debts, and local rivalries often disrupted trade. Politically, the early second millennium BCE in Anatolia was a mosaic of city-states, each ruled by a local king. The tablets from Kadesh refer to rulers of cities such as Mama, Zalpa, Hattusa, and Kadesh itself. Power was fluid, alliances shifted, and wars between these small polities were common. Yet, despite the competition, this environment of fragmented kingdoms allowed for experimentation in administration and diplomacy. The political landscape that the Hittites would later inherit was one that had already learned the value and the cost of treaties, alliances, and trade. It was during this period that the Indo-European speaking peoples, who would later be known as the Hittites, began to appear in central Anatolia. The exact origins of these groups are still debated by scholars, but linguistic and archaeological evidence suggests a gradual migration into the region during the early 2nd millennium BCE. These newcomers did not immediately conquer the land. Rather, they seem to have integrated into the existing Anatolian world, adopting much of its material culture and religion while preserving elements of their own language and social traditions. One of the earliest figures to emerge from this transitional time is a ruler named Pithana, king of Kusara. His son, Anita, provides us with one of the first written glimpses of early Hittite ambition. Anita left behind an inscription written in the old Hittite language on a clay tablet, declaring his conquest of several Anatolian cities, including Kadesh. In his text, Anita boasts of destroying Hattusa, cursing the site and proclaiming that it should never again be resettled. Ironically, within a few generations, Hattusa would become the capital of the very empire that traced its roots to his dynasty. Anita's inscription is more than a royal boast. It marks the earliest known use of the Hittite language in written form and demonstrates the fusion of Mesopotamian writing technology with Anatolian political power. The use of cuneiform, first brought by the Assyrian merchants, was now being adapted for local purposes. For the first time, Anatolian rulers could record their own deeds, preserve their laws, and communicate their authority beyond oral tradition. The economic and cultural exchanges of this period produced a layered society. In the urban centers, scribes trained in cuneiform documented trade and law. Artisans worked in bronze, gold, and pottery, crafting objects that reflected both local styles and foreign influences. Farmers and herders maintained the food base of the growing towns, while priests conducted rituals to ensure fertility and divine favor. The presence of both Hattian and Indo-European names in the same records hints at intermarriage and gradual assimilation among the peoples of central Anatolia. Religion remained central to Anatolian life. The storm god, known in later Hittite times as Tarhuna, had deep roots in this early Hattian tradition. The worship of the sun goddess, the protector of justice and order, also continued across the centuries. These deities, tied to the cycles of weather and harvest, reflected a worldview in which human survival depended on harmony with the divine forces that governed nature. This spiritual continuity would later help the Hittites unify a diverse empire through shared festivals and religious traditions. The geography of Anatolia shaped its history as much as its peoples did. The region's high plateaus, mountain ranges, and limited river systems encouraged the development of small, independent centers rather than large, unified states. Communication was slow, and control over distant territories was difficult. Yet the same geography made Anatolia rich in natural resources, metals, timber, and fertile valleys that attracted traders and conquerors alike. Whoever could harness these resources and control the key routes across the plateau would command great power. By the 17th century BCE, the balance of power in the region was beginning to shift. The Assyrian trade colonies declined, likely due to changing political conditions and local resistance. Many of the Karum were abandoned, and the written records they left behind ceased. But their legacy endured. Cuneiform literacy, record-keeping, and diplomatic conventions remained part of Anatolian political culture. The stage was set for a new kind of kingdom, one that would unite the fractured city-states and project power far beyond the Anatolian plateau. This early foundation period was critical in shaping what would follow. The Hittites inherited the Hattian religious landscape, the Assyrian administrative tools, and the experience of centuries of local warfare and diplomacy. When their kings finally rose to prominence, they did not emerge from a vacuum. They built upon layers of social and cultural evolution that had already transformed central Anatolia into a sophisticated and connected region. As the early 2nd millennium BCE unfolded, the once bustling Assyrian trading colonies across Anatolia began to fade. Their departure did not bring decline, but rather transformation. The knowledge they left behind, writing, accounting, and an understanding of complex trade relations, remained in local hands. In the power vacuum that followed, new rulers rose among the Anatolian highlands. They were ambitious, organized, and unlike any who had ruled the region before. These were the early Hittites, the heirs to both Hattian culture and Indo-European speech, and they were about to reshape the political landscape of central Anatolia. In the city of Kadesh, once a hub of Assyrian trade, a dynasty began to emerge. One of the earliest known rulers from this time was Pithana, king of Kusara, a city whose exact location remains uncertain, but which was likely situated southeast of Kadesh. Pithana's campaigns are remembered not for their destruction, but for their unification. His conquests were among the first signs of a ruler seeking not merely plunder, but stable governance over multiple cities. He established control over Kadesh, one of the most influential centers in the region, and through this act began the consolidation of Anatolia under a single lineage. Pithana's son, Anita, inherited more than his father's territory. He inherited his ambition. Anita's reign marks a decisive step toward the creation of a unified Anatolian kingdom. His own words survive on a clay tablet written in Old Hittite cuneiform, known today as the Anita text. It is the earliest preserved document written in an Indo-European language, and it offers a rare first-hand voice from this distant era. In it, Anita declares proudly, "I am Anita, great king, son of Pithana, king of Kusara." With that title, he presents himself not as a mere city ruler, but as a sovereign over multiple lands, a claim that would set the tone for Hittite kingship for centuries to come. The Anita text recounts the expansion of his power. From his base in Kusara, Anita conquered Kadesh, making it his capital. From there, he launched further campaigns against neighboring cities, including Zalpa and Hattusa. His victories were not only military, but also symbolic. In capturing Hattusa, the powerful city of the Hattians, Anita declared his dominance over the region's past as well as its present. According to his own record, he destroyed Hattusa and laid a curse upon it, proclaiming that no one should rebuild the city again. The irony of this declaration would echo through history, for within a few generations, Hattusa would rise from its ashes to become the heart of the Hittite Empire. Anita's campaigns reveal more than a ruler's ambition. They reflect a profound shift in Anatolia's political organization. For the first time, a king sought to bind multiple regions under a centralized rule, maintaining authority through appointed officials and fortified strongholds. This was no longer the world of loosely allied city-states trading and fighting in cycles. It was the birth of a kingdom with administrative intent. Religion and ideology also played key roles in legitimizing Anita's authority. His inscriptions invoke the favor of deities such as the storm god and the sun goddess, both inherited from the older Hattian pantheon. In claiming divine sanction, Anita was not only borrowing from local tradition, but also creating a political theology that would become a cornerstone of Hittite kingship. To rule was to serve the gods, to ensure their rituals were kept, and to maintain cosmic order. The king stood as both warrior and high priest, a model that future Hittite monarchs would adopt fully. The period following Anita's reign remains somewhat obscure, but the fragments that survive suggest a gradual consolidation of power centered around the cities of Kadesh, Kusara, and later Hattusa. These centers became the foundation of a political system that balanced military expansion with a developing bureaucracy. Scribes trained in cuneiform recorded treaties, land grants, and royal decrees. The Hittite language, already used by Anita, began to spread as the administrative medium of the emerging kingdom. This early phase of Hittite history is sometimes called the Proto-Hittite, or pre-imperial period. It is a time when the building blocks of empire were being laid: administration, diplomacy, law, and religion, but before the appearance of the fully organized Hittite state that would dominate later centuries. The rulers who followed Anita inherited a complex legacy: the political fragmentation of Anatolia, the cultural depth of Hattian tradition, and the practical tools of Mesopotamian record-keeping. One of the key transitions of this time was the movement of the political center from Kadesh to Hattusa, Though Anita had once cursed Hattusa, a later ruler, possibly named Labarna, or an early ancestor bearing that title, chose it as the new seat of power. The reasons were likely strategic. Hattusa's position in the highlands made it defensible, surrounded by ridges and valleys that could be fortified with walls. It also lay near important trade routes, connecting the Anatolian plateau to the north and south. From this location, a ruler could project power in multiple directions, overseeing both the inner lands of Anatolia and the routes leading to Syria and beyond. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this transitional period, Hattusa underwent significant rebuilding. Massive fortifications, temples, and administrative complexes began to appear. The city's urban layout reflected a growing sense of central authority. What had once been a network of competing towns was now being molded into a single political organism, with Hattusa as its beating heart. The cultural landscape of this early kingdom was richly layered. The Hittites adopted much from the Hattians, their deities, festivals, and ritual practices, while also introducing Indo-European linguistic and social elements. The royal titles, court ceremonies, and methods of record-keeping all reveal a fusion of influences. This blending of traditions would become a defining strength of Hittite civilization, the ability to absorb and harmonize the diverse peoples under its rule. Foreign relations also began to take shape in this period. The Hittite rulers of the early Old Kingdom engaged with neighboring lands through both warfare and diplomacy. To the south, in northern Syria, lay the powerful kingdom of Yamhad, centered in Aleppo, which would become both rival and trading partner in the centuries to come. To the north, the mountainous regions were inhabited by the Kaska peoples, who frequently raided Anatolian settlements. To the west lay the rich lands of Arzawa, a collection of city-states along the Aegean coast. Each of these regions interacted with early Hittite rulers in ways that foreshadowed the wider imperial ambitions of their descendants. The establishment of kingship in Anatolia was not merely a political shift, but a social transformation. The old city-state elites, local chieftains, merchants, and priests, had to adapt to the growing authority of a central monarch. In many cases, these local leaders were integrated into the royal administration, serving as governors or military commanders under the king's oversight. This created a more hierarchical society, one that could mobilize resources and armies on a scale previously impossible. The concept of law also began to evolve during this era. Although the famous Hittite law codes would not be formalized until later, the foundation for legal administration was being laid. Written contracts, first introduced by the Assyrians, became standard practice. Disputes over land, inheritance, and trade were increasingly handled through recorded judgments rather than personal retaliation. This shift toward codified justice reflected the growing sophistication of the Hittite political order. Religious ceremonies reinforced the king's authority. The performance of rituals, seasonal festivals, offerings to the storm god, and purification rites linked the stability of the state to divine favor. These traditions provided both spiritual legitimacy and a sense of unity among diverse communities. Every harvest, every victory, and every royal succession was understood as part of a divine plan. By the middle of the 17th century BCE, the lands of central Anatolia were no longer a loose patchwork of city-states. The foundations laid by the rulers of Kadesh and Kusara had matured into something greater, a true kingdom, organized and ambitious. From this moment, the Hittite story enters its first fully documented phase, the Old Kingdom. It is in this period that we can finally see the emergence of a dynasty, a royal court, and a clear sense of empire building. At its head stood two pivotal rulers, Labarna the First, who consolidated the early state, and Hattusa the First, who turned that state into a conquering power stretching beyond the Anatolian plateau. Labarna the First is often regarded as the founder of the Hittite royal dynasty. His reign marks the transition from scattered rule to centralized monarchy. The sources that mention him are fragmentary, but what survives paints the image of a ruler who imposed order on a fragmented land. The name Labarna itself became so closely associated with kingship that it would later serve as a dynastic title, much like Pharaoh in Egypt or Caesar in Rome. The symbolic weight of that name reveals how deeply his model of rule influenced the generations that followed. Under Labarna I, the Hittite realm began to take shape around the northern and central regions of Anatolia. His control extended over a network of cities and fortresses that had once been independent. The king appointed members of his family to govern these centers, creating a system of royal viceroys bound by kinship and loyalty. This approach not only ensured political stability, but also laid the groundwork for the Hittite method of rule, balancing local autonomy with central authority. Labarna's achievements were not merely administrative. He is credited with initiating the military and diplomatic expansion that would characterize Hittite power for centuries. His campaigns extended into southern Anatolia and possibly toward the coastal regions, where he sought control over vital trade routes leading to Syria and the Mediterranean. Through these efforts, he began to connect the Highland Kingdom with the wider Near Eastern world. Religion also played a defining role during his reign. The cults of the storm god and the sun goddess were elevated to royal prominence, symbolizing both cosmic order and political legitimacy. These deities were not only worshipped in temples but also invoked in royal decrees, treaties, and public rituals. The king's authority was understood as divinely sanctioned. To disobey the monarch was to disrupt the sacred balance between the gods and humanity. This close integration of faith and governance would remain a hallmark of Hittite rule for centuries. When Labarna I died, he left behind not merely a collection of territories but a functioning state. His successor, Hattusili I, possibly his adopted son or close relative, would take that foundation and expand it into an empire. The name Hattusili, meaning man of Hattusa, signaled a powerful symbolic decision to make Hattusa, the very city once cursed by Anita, the capital of the kingdom. This act was more than practical. It was a statement of renewal, reclaiming Anatolia's past and asserting Hittite dominance over it. Hattusa's geography made it an ideal capital. Situated in the northern Anatolian highlands, surrounded by hills and narrow valleys, it could be easily defended. Its commanding position also allowed control over key routes linking the central plateau with the Black Sea to the north and the fertile lands of Syria to the south. Archaeological remains from Hattusili's era show early fortifications and palace complexes, evidence of a city being transformed into the seat of a growing imperial state. Hattusili I was not content with ruling central Anatolia alone. His ambitions extended far beyond the mountains of Hatti. He launched a series of campaigns that carried Hittite arms deep into northern Syria, confronting city-states that had long been under the influence of the powerful kingdom of Yamhad, centered in Aleppo. In these wars, we can see the first expression of the Hittite imperial idea, that to secure Anatolia, the king must also dominate the lands to the south. The Annals of Hattusili I, a royal inscription written in the Hittite language, records his conquests and his vision of kingship. The text describes how he campaigned in the regions of Hahum, Alalak, and other Syrian cities. His objective was not only to seize wealth or territory, but to control the trade routes connecting Anatolia with Mesopotamia. These routes carried metals, textiles, and grain, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age economy. By securing them, Hattusili positioned his kingdom as a central power in the regional balance of the Near East. Yet, his reign was not without challenges. Like many early empire builders, Hattusili had to contend with internal rebellion and familial betrayal. His annals describe conflicts with his own relatives, whom he had appointed as governors in distant provinces. These rebellions reveal the difficulty of maintaining loyalty across a rapidly expanding realm. Even the king's own family was not immune to the temptations of independence. In one striking passage, Hattusili laments that his designated heir, his sister's son, turned against him. The king, old and ill, replaced his nephew with his grandson, Mursili, before his death. The scene, preserved in his final testament, captures the deeply personal struggles behind the formation of the empire. Despite these internal tensions, Hattusili's accomplishments were immense. He brought a vast portion of Anatolia under centralized control and extended Hittite influence into northern Syria. His administrative reforms strengthened the state's infrastructure. The royal court at Hattusa became not only a political center, but also a hub of learning and record-keeping. Scribes maintained archives of treaties, inventories, and royal correspondence. These practices reflect a maturing bureaucracy that would later become one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Hattusili's reign also marked the formalization of royal ideology. The king was portrayed as both warrior and priest, servant of the gods and guardian of justice. His annals depict a ruler who saw divine will as guiding every campaign and decision. Before setting out to war, he performed elaborate rituals to secure the favor of the storm god and other deities. In defeat or victory, he credited the gods for his fate. This deep intertwining of religion and kingship gave the Hittite monarchy a sense of sacred duty that transcended mere politics. The impact of Hattusili's southern campaigns extended far beyond military conquest. By attacking cities in northern Syria, he disrupted the long-standing power of Yamhad and opened new corridors of communication with Mesopotamia. This expansion brought the Hittites into contact, and at times into conflict, with the other great powers of the age, including Babylon and the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. It was through these early encounters that the Hittites began to be recognized as a force to be reckoned with in the broader Near Eastern world. Within Anatolia itself, Hattusili continued to fortify and integrate his kingdom. Roads were built or improved to connect distant provinces with the capital. Temples were endowed with land and labor, ensuring the loyalty of the priesthood. Local rulers were either replaced with loyal vassals or bound to the crown through treaties sealed by oaths before the gods. These oaths were taken seriously. To violate one was not only treason, but sacrilege. Such measures provided both a political and a spiritual foundation for imperial unity. Culturally, the Hittite kingdom under Hattusili began to develop a distinct identity. The royal court became a melting pot of Anatolian, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian influences. The scribes of Hattusa used Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Near East, for correspondence with foreign rulers, while domestic administration was increasingly conducted in the Hittite language. Art and architecture blended native Anatolian traditions with imported styles, creating a unique visual culture that reflected the diversity of the empire. As Hattusili's life drew to a close, he faced the inevitable challenge of succession. His own writings reveal his frustration with betrayal within his household, a recurring theme that would haunt Hittite history. In his testament, he describes his sorrow and disappointment at being deserted by those closest to him. Yet he also expresses hope that his chosen successor, his grandson Mursili, would continue his work and bring the Hittite state to even greater heights. It was a hope well placed, for under Mursili, the young heir, the Hittites would achieve their most astonishing feat yet, the march on Babylon itself. When Hattusili I died, the future of the Hittite kingdom rested in uncertain hands. He had spent his final years trying to secure the succession, naming his grandson Mursili as his heir after a series of betrayals within his family. The boy who inherited the throne was young, perhaps still in his teens, and the empire his grandfather had built was fragile. Yet, within a few decades, Mursili I would achieve a feat so audacious that it would shake the entire Near Eastern world. His campaign against Babylon, carried out over vast distances and with remarkable precision, remains one of the most daring military expeditions in ancient history. Mursili's rise to power was not straightforward. The royal court of Hattusa, as with many early monarchies, was rife with intrigue. Powerful nobles, generals, and relatives often sought to influence the throne, and the transition between rulers was always a moment of danger. Hattusili's decision to bypass his nephew and install Mursili as king had likely angered other factions within the royal family. Yet, despite his youth, Mursili proved capable of maintaining control. His authority rested on the loyalty of the army and the legitimacy granted by divine sanction. In the Hittite view, the gods had chosen him, just as they had once favored his grandfather. From the beginning of his reign, Suppiluliuma the First faced the challenge of preserving and extending the empire his predecessors had created. The Hittite realm now stretched across much of central Anatolia, but its hold on distant regions, especially northern Syria, remained precarious. To the south, rival kingdoms like Aleppo and the remnants of Yamhad sought to reassert their independence. To the north, the fierce Kaska tribes continued to raid the Hittite frontier. Consolidation was essential, and Suppiluliuma's early campaigns reflect a determination to restore order and project strength. The first major test of his rule came in northern Syria. His grandfather had weakened Yamhad, but Aleppo, the capital of that kingdom, remained defiant. Suppiluliuma launched a decisive campaign against it, possibly in alliance with Hurrian forces, who also opposed Yamhad. The details of the conflict are scarce, but it is clear that Aleppo was eventually subdued. Its fall removed the last major obstacle to Hittite control in northern Syria and opened the way for further expansion. The victory also brought immense wealth, tribute, captives, and access to trade routes connecting Anatolia with Mesopotamia. Having secured his southern frontier, Suppiluliuma turned his attention farther east, toward Mesopotamia itself. His next campaign would take the Hittite armies beyond any previous horizon, deep into the heart of the Babylonian kingdom. The reasons for this extraordinary expedition remain the subject of scholarly debate. Some historians believe that Suppiluliuma sought to avenge earlier conflicts or to disrupt the alliances of his rivals. Others suggest that it was a campaign of opportunity, a raid designed to seize wealth and prestige. Whatever his motives, the journey from central Anatolia to Babylon, across mountains, rivers, and hostile territories, was an undertaking of astonishing scale. At the time, Babylon was ruled by the last kings of the Amorite dynasty founded centuries earlier by Hammurabi. The city was still one of the most prosperous and symbolically powerful centers of the Near East, though its political influence had begun to wane. Internal instability and external threats from the rising Kassite tribes had weakened its defenses. Into this situation marched Suppiluliuma's army, crossing hundreds of miles through foreign lands to strike at one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. The sack of Babylon, around 1595 BCE, was a defining moment in early Near Eastern history. The Hittite forces entered the city, looted its temples and palaces, and carried away immense treasures, including the statue of the city's chief god, Marduk. Contemporary sources from Babylon describe the event as catastrophic, marking the end of the Amorite dynasty and plunging Mesopotamia into a period of political fragmentation. For the Hittites, the campaign was both a triumph and a turning point. It demonstrated their capacity for long-distance warfare and their ability to project power beyond their immediate sphere. Yet, the victory brought no lasting territorial gain. Suppiluliuma did not attempt to occupy Babylon or establish direct rule there. Instead, after plundering the city, he turned his forces back toward Anatolia. The reasons for this are practical as well as strategic. The Hittite heartland was far too distant to control Mesopotamia effectively, and the expedition had likely stretched the limits of their logistical capacity. Maintaining garrisons and supply lines over such distances would have been impossible. What Suppiluliuma sought and achieved was prestige. The destruction of Babylon elevated him to the status of a world conqueror, placing the Hittites among the ranks of the great powers of the Bronze Age. However, triumph quickly gave way to turmoil. Upon his return to Hattusa, Suppiluliuma faced betrayal from within his own court. His brother-in-law, Hantili, conspired against him, assisted by others within the royal household. The young king, who had achieved such astonishing victories abroad, was assassinated in his own capital. His death unleashed a period of chaos and succession struggles that would shake the Hittite kingdom to its core. The motives behind the conspiracy remain unclear, but they likely stemmed from the same sources that had plagued Hittite politics since its foundation: rivalry among powerful elites and the unstable balance between the king and his relatives. Anatolian, who seized the throne after Mursili's death, was himself overthrown a few years later, continuing a grim cycle of coups and counter-coups. This instability eroded much of the political structure that Labarna and Hattusa had built, leading to decades of decline and fragmentation. The assassination of Mursili also had broader consequences beyond Anatolia. The sudden withdrawal of the Hittite army from Mesopotamia left a vacuum that allowed the Kassites to seize control of Babylon. Under their rule, which would last for several centuries, Babylon regained stability and became a major cultural force once again. Ironically, the Hittite raid that had destroyed the old order in Mesopotamia indirectly paved the way for a new one to rise in its place. For the Hittites, however, the aftermath was far more damaging. The loss of a strong central ruler exposed the fragility of their political system. Without Mursili's authority, local governors and military commanders began to act independently, and foreign enemies took advantage of the disorder. The Kaska tribes renewed their raids in the north, while rebellious vassals in Syria sought to break free. The empire that had briefly reached the gates of Babylon now struggled to defend its own borders. The internal instability that followed Mursili's death forced the Hittites to reconsider the nature of kingship itself. Over the next century, a series of rulers would attempt to restore order, culminating in reforms that sought to limit the bloodshed of dynastic succession. These efforts would eventually lead to the famous Edict of Telepinu, which codified the rules of royal inheritance and marked a crucial step in the development of Hittite law and governance. But that reform lay still in the future. In the immediate aftermath of Mursili's assassination, the Hittite kingdom entered what some historians call its first dark age. Despite this period of crisis, the legacy of Mursili the First endured. His conquest of Babylon left an indelible mark on the historical consciousness of the ancient Near East. Even centuries later, Hittite and Mesopotamian records referred to the event as a moment of great upheaval. It symbolized both the heights of Hittite ambition and the dangers of overreach. In the long arc of their history, the Hittites would return again and again to the themes that defined Mursili's reign: bold expansion, divine justification, and the ever-present tension between power and stability. The story of Mursili the First also reveals much about the nature of early empires. His ability to mobilize armies, maintain discipline over long distances, and command loyalty from a diverse population speaks to the administrative sophistication of the Old Kingdom. The use of written records, treaties, and formal oaths ensured a level of organization that few contemporary states could match. Even as internal strife later weakened the kingdom, these systems of governance remained in place, providing a framework that future rulers could rebuild upon. The assassination of Mursili I had thrown the Hittite kingdom into chaos. The empire that had once conquered Babylon now found itself unraveling from within. In the absence of a strong and legitimate ruler, the old patterns of rivalry, revenge, and ambition re-emerged at the royal court. Over the course of several generations, kings rose and fell through conspiracy and bloodshed, while the borders of the realm shrank under pressure from rebellious vassals and foreign enemies. Out of this period of disorder came one of the most remarkable documents in ancient history, the Edict of Telepinu. Written in calm, deliberate language, it sought to impose order on the succession and restore the moral foundation of kingship in the land of Hatti. The century that followed Mursili's death was one of instability and decline. His brother-in-law, Anatolian, who had orchestrated the assassination, seized the throne but failed to bring peace. His reign and those of his successors were marked by insecurity and distrust. The royal family became trapped in a cycle of vengeance. Sons killed fathers, brothers betrayed brothers, and courtiers manipulated the throne for their own gain. The state that had once projected power into Syria and Mesopotamia now struggled to maintain control even in central Anatolia. As internal strife consumed the court, external dangers multiplied. The Kaska tribes of the northern mountains raided deeper into Hittite territory, threatening the capital itself. In the west, the rising powers of Arzawa challenged Hittite influence. To the south, former vassal cities in Syria took advantage of the turmoil to reassert their independence. Trade declined, fortresses fell into disrepair, and the unity that had once defined the kingdom seemed to vanish. It was in this context of crisis that Telepinu rose to power, sometime around the early 16th century BCE. His lineage traced back to the royal house founded by Labarna the First, but by his time, that legacy had been badly tarnished. Telepinu faced a kingdom weakened by generations of violence and corruption. Yet, unlike many of his predecessors, he was not merely a warrior king. He was a statesman and reformer, a ruler who understood that the survival of the Hittite state depended not on conquest, but on restoring legitimacy and trust in the monarchy. The document that bears his name, the Edict of Telepinu, is both a historical narrative and a legal proclamation. It begins with a sober account of the kingdom's decline, tracing the chain of murders and betrayals that had followed the death of Mursili. In one passage, Telepinu laments how, in earlier times, brothers and sisters, children and in-laws lived in harmony. But later, they began to plot evil against one another. The tone is not accusatory, but reflective, as if the king were diagnosing a sickness in the body of the state. His solution was to reform the very structure of royal succession and establish clear rules for governance. At the heart of the edict was a simple yet profound idea. The stability of the realm depended on the orderly transfer of power. Telepinu decreed that the throne should pass by bloodline to the eldest male heir. If the king had no sons, the right of succession would fall to his brothers, and failing that, to the sons of his brothers. Only when no legitimate male heir remained could a son-in-law or adopted relative ascend the throne. By setting this order in writing, Telepinu aimed to eliminate the ambiguity that had fueled so many deadly rivalries. Equally important was the emphasis on justice and restraint. Telepinu explicitly forbade acts of vengeance and assassination among members of the royal family. Those guilty of treason or conspiracy were to be tried before the Pankas, an assembly of nobles and officials that acted as a check on royal authority. This institution did not diminish the power of the king, but rather grounded it in a framework of law and communal accountability. The Pankas would later fade from prominence, but its existence at this time shows that the Hittite monarchy, even at its height, operated within a legal order rather than pure autocracy. The Edict of Telepinu also reveals a broader moral philosophy that guided his reforms. It reflects the Hittite belief that the king's duty was not merely to rule, but to maintain the balance between the gods, the people, and the land. Violence within the royal family was seen not only as a political crime, but as a religious offense that disrupted cosmic harmony. The gods of Hatti demanded justice, honesty, and proper ritual conduct. By purging the court of corruption and ensuring lawful succession, the king was, in essence, performing a sacred act of restoration. Under Telepinu's leadership, the Hittite state began to recover some measure of stability. He reorganized the administration, appointing trustworthy officials to oversee the provinces and ensuring that tribute and taxes reached the capital. Efforts were made to rebuild fortifications and restore trade routes. Relations with neighboring states were normalized through treaties and diplomacy rather than war. Though the empire's former territories in Syria were lost for the time being, Telepinu's reign brought internal peace, a necessary foundation for the resurgence that would come in later centuries. Telepinu's reforms also had lasting implications for the development of Hittite law. His emphasis on written codes and procedural justice influenced later legal compilations, such as the Hittite Law Code, which survives in fragmentary form on clay tablets. These laws covered everything from property rights and labor obligations to personal injury and family disputes. They reveal a society that valued compensation over retribution and sought to balance punishment with fairness. For example, many offenses that might have been punished by death in other ancient cultures were instead settled by fines or restitution. This pragmatic approach reflects the same spirit of moderation found in Telepinu's edict. Although Telepinu's reign was not one of territorial expansion, it marked a turning point in the history of the Hittite kingdom. His reforms provided a constitutional framework that would guide future rulers and prevent the kind of dynastic chaos that had nearly destroyed the state. In many ways, he can be seen as the lawgiver of the Hittites, the monarch who transformed kingship from a personal prize into a regulated institution. The edict's impact extended beyond its immediate political function. It became a statement of royal philosophy, copied and preserved in Hittite archives for centuries. Later kings would refer back to it as a moral and legal precedent, citing Telepinu's wisdom in times of crisis. The document's survival into the modern age, rediscovered among the clay tablets of Hattusa, attests to its enduring significance in the memory of the Hittite people. In assessing Telepinu's legacy, it is important to recognize the restraint and realism of his vision. Unlike the warrior kings who sought glory through conquest, he understood that the true strength of a state lay in its ability to govern itself justly. His reign may lack the dramatic campaigns of earlier rulers, but it achieved something far more enduring: the re-establishment of lawful order after a century of chaos. Still, the stability that Telepinu created was fragile. The external world was changing. New powers were rising in Mesopotamia and Syria, while the political map of Anatolia continued to shift. The Hittite state survived, but it no longer held the commanding position it had enjoyed under Hattusili and Mursili. For the next 100 years, the kingdom would remain relatively quiet, a time of consolidation and internal development rather than outward expansion. Historians often refer to this phase as the Middle Hittite period. It was an era when the institutions created by Telepinu were tested and refined, setting the stage for the rebirth of Hittite power in the centuries to come. Telepinu's death marked the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of a more introspective age. Though his successors ruled in relative obscurity, the order he established allowed the state to endure when many others in the region collapsed. In that sense, his contribution to Hittite history is not measured by conquest, but by endurance. He gave the kingdom the ability to survive crisis, a quality that would prove essential in the turbulent centuries ahead. After the reforms of Telepinu, the Hittite kingdom entered a quieter but deeply significant phase of its history. Historians refer to this period as the Middle Hittite era, a time of consolidation and rebuilding that stretched roughly across the 15th century BCE. It was not an age of great conquests or dramatic kings, but it was a period when the political, administrative, and religious foundations of the later empire were carefully laid. Though the external borders of Hatti contracted, its internal structures became stronger, more organized, and more capable of enduring the challenges to come. Telepinu had brought an end to the vicious cycle of assassinations and feuds that had crippled the kingdom for generations. Yet the peace he restored was fragile. After his death, there is a long gap in our knowledge of the Hittite rulers. The historical record grows faint and the surviving inscriptions are few. This scarcity of evidence suggests that the Hittite state continued to exist, but in a diminished form, its kings ruling a smaller territory centered on Hattusa and its immediate surroundings. The once expansive borders that had reached into Syria during the Old Kingdom were now lost. But in this apparent decline, something crucial was happening: the reorganization of the kingdom into a more durable form. The political map of Anatolia during this period was fragmented. To the west, the kingdom of Arzawa rose as a dominant power, controlling much of western Anatolia and the coastal lands near the Aegean. To the south, the kingdom of Kidzuwatna emerged in the Cilician plain, maintaining strong cultural ties with the Hurrian world. To the east, the Hurrian-speaking Mitanni state was expanding rapidly, becoming a major rival to both Egypt and the remaining Hittite realm. Surrounded by these powers, the Hittites adopted a defensive posture, focusing their attention on internal unity and institutional strength rather than foreign conquest. In the capital, Hattusa, the royal court became more structured. Administrative offices were formalized, and written record-keeping became increasingly central to governance. The archives that later generations would expand began to take shape during this time. Clay tablets recorded not only treaties and legal decrees, but also inventories, land grants, and temple offerings. Bureaucracy was no longer a tool for crisis management. It was now the permanent backbone of government. Religion, always at the heart of Hittite society, also evolved in this period. The pantheon of gods continued to grow, reflecting the kingdom's diverse cultural influences. The Hittites were remarkably inclusive in their worship. As they came into contact with other peoples, Hurrians, Luwians, and Syrians, they adopted foreign deities into their own rituals. This inclusiveness would later lead to what scholars call the Thousand Gods of Hatti, a phrase that captured both the richness and the complexity of Hittite religion. During the Middle Period, the rituals of worship were carefully codified, with priests responsible for maintaining the daily offerings and festivals that honored each deity. One of the most striking features of Hittite religion at this time was its emphasis on continuity. Kings and priests sought to preserve ancient rituals from the Old Kingdom, copying old hymns and prayers to ensure that the proper order of worship was maintained. The past was not seen as distant, it was a living authority. This attitude helped unify the diverse peoples under Hittite rule by grounding the state's identity in sacred tradition. Economically, the kingdom shifted toward stability and self-sufficiency. The loss of control over Syrian trade routes forced the Hittites to rely more heavily on Anatolia's internal resources. The region's fertile valleys and mineral wealth provided a solid economic base. Agricultural production was managed through a network of royal estates and temple lands, while metalworking, especially in bronze and iron, became increasingly sophisticated. The state also maintained control over herds, timber, and mineral extraction, resources essential for both the economy and the military. The army itself underwent a process of reorganization. The long campaigns of the Old Kingdom were no longer possible, but military discipline remained a priority. The king's authority still rested, in part, on his ability to defend the realm and command loyalty from his troops. Garrisons were maintained in key fortresses across the central plateau, particularly along the northern frontier, where the Kaska tribes remained a constant menace. These mountain-dwelling raiders continued to harass Hittite settlements, burning crops and attacking caravans. Though they never formed a unified state, their persistent incursions kept the Hittite kings vigilant. Culturally, the Middle Hittite period was marked by growing Hurrian influence. The Hurrians, whose kingdom of Mitanni dominated northern Mesopotamia and Syria, were becoming the most powerful cultural force in the region. Their language, religion, and art spread across Anatolia, blending with native Hittite traditions. Many Hurrian deities, such as Teshub, the storm god, and Hebat, the sun goddess, were integrated into Hittite worship. Even royal names and titles from this period reflect this cross-cultural exchange. This blending of traditions gave the Hittite state a unique character, neither purely Indo-European nor wholly Anatolian, but a synthesis of many civilizations. It is during this time that we begin to see the emergence of new legal and administrative practices that foreshadowed the later imperial system. The Hittite law codes, preserved in later copies, likely took their earliest form in this period. They provide a detailed picture of Hittite society and its values. The laws reveal a people deeply concerned with fairness, order, and the regulation of daily life. Punishments were generally moderate compared to those of neighboring states, focusing on compensation rather than retribution. This emphasis on measured justice reflects the same pragmatic spirit that had guided Telepinu's reforms. Marriage, property, and inheritance were carefully defined. Contracts were written on clay tablets, witnessed by officials, and sealed to prevent disputes. Slavery existed but was regulated. Slaves could own property and even purchase their freedom. The rights of women, particularly in property matters, were relatively well protected compared to other ancient societies. These laws and administrative reforms helped to create a sense of social stability that endured even through political decline. While the Middle Hittite kings did not leave behind the monumental inscriptions of their imperial successors, their work behind the scenes was vital. They maintained the continuity of the royal line, upheld the legal system, and preserved the memory of their ancestors. Each generation kept the state alive, ensuring that when the time came for renewed expansion, the kingdom would be ready. The architecture of Hattusa during this period also reflects this steady resilience. The city's fortifications were maintained and expanded, new temples were built, and administrative complexes grew around the royal palace. The layout of Hattusa began to resemble the city that would later astonish archaeologists, an urban center organized around both political authority and sacred space. In foreign relations, the Hittite kings of this era were cautious but not isolated. They engaged in diplomacy with neighboring states, often through marriage alliances and treaties. Some scholars believe that the Middle Hittite rulers may have signed agreements with the kingdom of Kidzuwatna, seeking to secure peace along the southern frontier. These alliances often had religious dimensions, sealed by oaths invoking the gods of both nations. The use of written treaties, each side keeping a copy in its own archives, was a practice inherited from earlier centuries and refined during this time. It would later become one of the hallmarks of Hittite diplomacy. The quiet strength of this era should not be underestimated. Though the Middle Hittite kings remain shadowy figures in our records, their achievements were profound. They turned a fractured state into a stable core, one capable of surviving isolation, invasion, and change. When later generations of rulers embarked on new campaigns of conquest, they did so upon the solid foundation built during these centuries of consolidation. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Middle Hittite period was its preservation of knowledge. The scribes of Hattusa continued to copy older texts, not only royal decrees and laws, but also myths, rituals, and hymns. These texts would later serve as the cultural treasury of the Hittite Empire, preserving both native traditions and foreign influences. The continuity of writing and record-keeping ensured that the wisdom of past generations was never lost, even in times of crisis. By the closing years of the 15th century BCE, the Hittite kingdom had endured generations of internal reform, patient rebuilding, and quiet resilience. The long peace that followed Telepinu's reign had given the state stability, but it had also left it somewhat isolated and vulnerable. Powerful neighbors had arisen on every frontier. The Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni dominated northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia. The Arzawan states controlled western Anatolia, and the restless Kaska tribes continued to press from the north. The Hittite kings of this period faced a fundamental question. Could their realm remain a cautious regional power, or would it once again assert itself as a dominant force in the Near East? It was during this period of tension and uncertainty that a ruler named Suppiluliuma the Third emerged. His reign marks a turning point, the moment when the Hittite kingdom, after centuries of consolidation, began its transformation into a renewed imperial state. The exact chronology of Suppiluliuma's reign is difficult to fix, as the records from this era remain fragmentary. Yet, what can be reconstructed shows a monarch of determination and vision, one who recognized both the dangers surrounding Hatti and the opportunities that lay ahead. The world Suppiluliuma inherited was complex. To the south and east, the kingdom of Mitanni stood as a formidable rival. The Mitannians, a Hurrian-speaking people with Indo-Aryan elements in their aristocracy, had built an empire that extended from northern Mesopotamia into Syria. They controlled vital trade routes and buffer states that once belonged to the Hittites during their Old Kingdom glory. To the west, the Arzawan states, loosely united under powerful local dynasts, dominated the rich Aegean coastlands, where contacts with Mycenaean Greece were beginning to intensify. Meanwhile, to the north, the Kaska tribes continued to harass Hittite borders, threatening the security of the capital itself. Suppiluliuma understood that the survival of Hatti required a new approach to leadership. The cautious diplomacy of the Middle Hittite period could no longer suffice. The kingdom's position demanded military renewal, strategic alliances, and a reinvigorated sense of royal authority. In this sense, Suppiluliuma stands at the threshold between the old, defensive Hatti and the imperial Hatti that would soon emerge under his successors. One of Suppiluliuma's first priorities was to strengthen the northern frontier. The Kaska problem had plagued the Hittite kingdom for centuries. These tribal groups, living in the rugged mountain zones near the Black Sea, were difficult to subdue. They did not form a centralized state, but their mobility and knowledge of the terrain allowed them to strike quickly and retreat into the forests. Tudhaliya launched several campaigns to push them back, fortifying key strongholds and re-establishing control over the lands surrounding Hattusa. Some evidence suggests that he even considered moving the royal court temporarily to a safer location further south, possibly to a city later identified as Samuha, when the Kaska threat became too severe. This defensive strategy reflected both realism and adaptability, the recognition that protecting the royal household was essential to preserving the continuity of kingship itself. At the same time, Tudhaliya turned his attention westward. The Arzawan states had grown powerful during the Hittite period of weakness, controlling trade routes and forming alliances that excluded Hatti. The western frontier, stretching toward the Aegean, represented not only a geopolitical challenge, but also an economic one. Control over these regions meant access to metals, timber, and routes for trade with the Mycenaean world. Tudhaliya's campaigns in the west sought to reclaim lost influence and to break the growing power of Arzawa's rulers. While the results were mixed, these efforts demonstrated a shift in Hittite foreign policy, from defense toward cautious expansion. In the south, the situation with Mitanni demanded careful diplomacy. Direct confrontation with such a powerful neighbor would have been disastrous at this stage. Instead, Tudhaliya pursued a strategy of alliance building. He sought to strengthen ties with smaller states on the periphery of Mitanni's influence, such as Kizzuwatna in southeastern Anatolia. Kizzuwatna had long been culturally Hurrian but politically flexible, often allying with whichever power seemed ascendant. By negotiating treaties and reaffirming shared religious and cultural ties, Tudhaliya succeeded in bringing Kizzuwatna back into the Hittite orbit. This move provided both a buffer zone and a valuable partner for future campaigns in Syria. Religion once again played a central role in legitimizing this renewal of power. Tudhaliya's inscriptions, though fragmentary, emphasize his devotion to the storm god and the sun goddess of Arina, the chief deities of Hatti. He sponsored temple construction and ritual purification ceremonies, presenting himself as the chosen servant of the gods who would restore order to the land. The return to a more vigorous kingship was framed not as a political ambition but as a divine mandate. In Hittite thought, the prosperity of the kingdom was inseparable from the favor of the gods, and the king's military success was seen as proof of divine support. The royal court under Tudhaliya also began to change in character. The administrative system that had matured during the Middle Period now became more centralized and professional. The king relied on a circle of trusted officials, scribes, generals, and priests, many of whom came from noble families with long traditions of service. These men formed the backbone of the empire's bureaucracy and military leadership. It is likely that Tudhaliya's own son, Arnuwanda, was trained within this system, gaining experience in governance and command that would serve him well when he later ascended the throne. The renewed sense of purpose within the kingdom was matched by advances in the organization of its army. Hittite military structure was highly disciplined, combining a professional corps with levied troops from provincial regions. Chariot warfare, the hallmark of Bronze Age power, became increasingly sophisticated. The Hittite chariot forces were designed for speed and endurance, relying on two-man teams, a driver and a warrior equipped with composite bows or spears. Tudhaliya's reign saw improvements in both chariot technology and battlefield tactics, innovations that would later give the Hittite army a decisive edge in its imperial campaigns. Despite these reforms, Tudhaliya's reign was not one of uninterrupted success. The kingdom remained vulnerable to attacks from multiple directions. The Kaska raids never fully ceased, and the rivalry with Mitanni continued to simmer. Yet, for all its difficulties, this was a period of transformation rather than stagnation. The Hittite state had regained its confidence, and its rulers had rediscovered the language of power. The days of quiet survival were ending. The age of imperial ambition was beginning. One of the most important outcomes of Tudhaliya's rule was the emergence of a dynastic continuity that would carry the Hittites into their greatest era. His successors, beginning with his son Anatolian the First and culminating in his grandson Suppiluliuma the First, would build upon his foundations to forge the Hittite Empire at its zenith. Tudhaliya's reforms in administration, military organization, and diplomacy created the mechanisms that made large-scale expansion possible. The period also marks a cultural and intellectual flowering within Hittite society. The archives from Hattusa and other centers show an increasing interest in recording myths, rituals, and historical annals. Many of the great religious texts that survive from later centuries were first compiled or adapted during this time. The Hittites, more than many of their contemporaries, valued written tradition as a means of preserving divine knowledge. The scribes who worked under Tudhaliya's patronage played a vital role in shaping the Hittite worldview, blending native, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian traditions into a coherent spiritual system. Diplomacy, too, became a refined art under Tudhaliya. The use of written treaties, sealed with oaths to the gods, was not new, but the sophistication of these agreements reached a new level. The treaties of this era were detailed documents outlining not only political obligations, but also moral expectations between allies. They invoked divine witnesses and specified curses for those who violated their terms. This legalistic approach to international relations would later culminate in the famous treaties of the imperial period, such as the peace agreement between Hatti and Egypt. By the middle of the 14th century BCE, the kingdom of Hatti stood at the threshold of a new age. The long years of survival and recovery under Tudhaliya III had given way to cautious expansion and renewed ambition. Yet it was under his descendant, Suppiluliuma the First, that the Hittite state was truly transformed into an empire, one that could rival Egypt, Assyria, and Mitanni as a dominant power in the ancient Near East. His reign marked the Hittite Golden Age, a period of decisive wars, brilliant diplomacy, and far-reaching cultural influence. Suppiluliuma was a conqueror, a reformer, and a strategist whose achievements would shape the destiny of his people for generations. When Suppiluliuma came to the throne, probably following a brief and troubled succession after his father, Anatolian I, the kingdom was surrounded by powerful enemies. The Hurrian state of Mitanni still controlled northern Syria and Mesopotamia, while Egypt under Amenhotep III dominated the southern Levant. To the west, the Arzawan states continued to exert influence over the Aegean coast, and the Kaska tribes persisted as a constant threat to the north. Yet Suppiluliuma did not inherit weakness. Thanks to the steady work of his predecessors, Hatti was once again politically stable, its armies disciplined, and its administration efficient. It was a realm ready for a ruler of vision and audacity, and Suppiluliuma was exactly that. From the outset, his ambition was clear. Suppiluliuma's early campaigns focused on securing the heartland. He launched vigorous military expeditions to pacify the Kaska frontier, rebuilding fortresses and reasserting control over northern Anatolia. The Kaska, ever elusive, could not be permanently subdued, but their raids were driven back, and Hattusa itself was strengthened with new defenses. Once the homeland was secure, Suppiluliuma turned his attention outward toward the south and east, toward Syria, where the long rivalry with Mitanni would finally be settled. At this time, Mitanni was in decline. Internal struggles and foreign pressure had weakened the once powerful kingdom. Suppiluliuma seized the opportunity. His campaign against Mitanni and its Syrian vassals was conducted with remarkable precision and speed, demonstrating the efficiency of the Hittite military system. The king himself led the armies, supported by a corps of skilled charioteers and disciplined infantry. His forces swept through northern Syria, capturing key cities such as Aleppo, Alalak, and Carchemish, names that had once stood as symbols of resistance to Hittite power. The conquest of Aleppo was especially significant. The city had long been a major Hurrian and Mitannian stronghold, controlling trade routes between Anatolia and Mesopotamia. By taking Aleppo, Suppiluliuma not only broke the power of Mitanni, but also gained control over the economic lifelines of the region. His policy was not simply to destroy, but to reorganize. He installed members of his own family as viceroys in the newly conquered territories, creating a network of loyal governors who ruled in his name. His son, Piasili, was appointed as ruler of Carchemish, one of the most important of these vassal states. This system allowed Suppiluliuma to project Hittite authority far beyond Anatolia while maintaining stability through dynastic loyalty. Diplomacy played as vital a role in Suppiluliuma's success as did warfare. He was a master negotiator who understood that lasting empire required both force and persuasion. His annals describe how he made treaties with defeated rulers, allowing them to retain their thrones in exchange for oaths of loyalty and tribute. These treaties, written on clay tablets and sealed with divine witnesses, became a defining feature of Hittite imperial policy. They laid out mutual obligations. The vassal pledged military support and allegiance, while the Hittite king promised protection and justice. This system transformed the old model of conquest into a structured empire bound by law and diplomacy. One of the most remarkable of Suppiluliuma's achievements was his handling of the Mitanni kingdom itself. After his victories in Syria, he did not seek to annihilate Mitanni completely. Instead, he intervened in its internal politics, supporting a rival claimant to the throne against the reigning king. By doing so, he turned a former enemy into a dependent ally. This shrewd manipulation of regional rivalries allowed the Hittites to dominate northern Mesopotamia without overstretching their resources. Suppiluliuma's influence extended even further through diplomacy with Egypt. During his reign, Egypt was ruled by the late 18th dynasty, first under Amenhotep III and later under Akhenaten, whose religious reforms had plunged the country into political uncertainty. It was during this tumultuous time that one of the most extraordinary episodes in ancient diplomacy occurred, the Dakamunzu affair. According to Hittite records, after the death of an Egyptian pharaoh, likely Tutankhamun, a letter arrived at Suppiluliuma's court from the Egyptian queen, referred to in Hittite as Dakamunzu, a rendering of the Egyptian title Ta Hemet Nesu, meaning the king's wife. In her message, she begged the Hittite king to send one of his sons to become her husband and rule Egypt beside her. She explained that she had no son of her own and that she did not wish to marry a servant of her late husband. The request was unprecedented. For a queen of Egypt to offer marriage to a foreign prince was almost unthinkable. Suppiluliuma, cautious but intrigued, sought confirmation. When a second message arrived reaffirming the queen's plea, he agreed and sent his son, Prince Zananza, to Egypt. The outcome was tragic. Somewhere along the journey, Zananza was murdered, likely by factions within the Egyptian court who opposed the alliance. The news infuriated Suppiluliuma. Viewing the act as treachery, he launched military reprisals against Egyptian-held territories in Syria, capturing numerous cities along the borderlands. These conflicts deepened the enmity between the two great powers and set the stage for future confrontations. Despite this setback, Suppiluliuma's reign remained one of triumph. His control over Syria brought immense wealth to the Hittite state. Caravans carried copper, silver, and luxury goods through the Hittite territories, enriching both the royal treasury and the merchant classes. The cities of northern Syria flourished under Hittite administration, serving as cultural crossroads where Anatolian, Hurrian, and Semitic traditions blended. The empire's capital, Hattusa, expanded and prospered, filled with temples, palaces, and archives. The later years of Suppiluliuma's reign, however, were shadowed by a tragic calamity. During his campaigns in Syria, Hittite soldiers captured numerous prisoners from Egyptian-held lands. Among them, it seems, was a group carrying a devastating epidemic, possibly plague. The disease spread rapidly through Hittite territory, reaching even the royal family. Suppiluliuma himself succumbed to the plague, bringing his extraordinary reign to an end. The epidemic continued for years, leaving deep scars on the kingdom and shaping the policies of his successors. Suppiluliuma's death marked the close of one of the most dynamic chapters in Hittite history. In less than a generation, he had transformed Hatti from a cautious, landlocked kingdom into a far-reaching empire. His military campaigns broke the power of Mitanni and brought Syria under Hittite control, while his diplomatic skills secured alliances and established a system of vassalage that ensured stability across vast territories. His reign also strengthened the ideological foundations of kingship. Like his forebears, he ruled as the servant of the gods, but unlike earlier kings, he wielded that divine mandate on a truly international stage. The world Suppiluliuma left behind was changed forever. The Hittite Empire now stood as one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, its kings corresponding as equals with the pharaohs of Egypt, the Kassite rulers of Babylon, and the kings of Assyria. The archives from Hattusa preserve letters written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time, in which Suppiluliuma and his successors addressed these foreign monarchs as brothers, a title reserved only for rulers of equal rank. Hatti, once a regional power hemmed in by its neighbors, now stood among the giants of the ancient world. Yet, the expansion that brought such glory also brought new challenges. Governing a diverse empire required constant vigilance, skilled diplomacy, and the ability to manage distant vassal states whose loyalties could shift with changing fortunes. The plague that struck the empire had not only taken its king but also weakened its population and army. Suppiluliuma's successors would inherit a vast but fragile realm, one that required wisdom as much as strength to preserve. When Suppiluliuma the First died, the Hittite Empire stood at the height of its power, but also at the edge of crisis. His conquests in Syria had created a vast and wealthy realm stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Yet the sudden arrival of plague, brought it seems by prisoners of war from Egyptian territory, struck the empire with devastating force. Suppiluliuma himself fell victim to the epidemic, leaving the throne to his son, Arnuwanda II. The new king inherited not only his father's empire, but also the chaos of disease, unrest, and instability that followed. Arnuwanda's reign, though short, reveals the immense challenges of ruling an empire in crisis. The plague had killed thousands across Hatti, decimating the population and weakening the army. Famine and economic disruption followed as harvests failed and trade routes faltered. To make matters worse, the empire's enemies sensed its vulnerability. The restless Kaska tribes once again descended from the northern mountains, raiding settlements and threatening the capital. In Syria, vassal states that Suppiluliuma had subdued now began to rebel, hoping to reclaim their independence while Hatti struggled to recover. Despite these challenges, Arnuwanda showed determination and competence. He continued his father's policies, maintaining correspondence with vassal kings and sending troops to suppress revolts in the southern provinces. His reign is documented in a handful of surviving letters and prayers, which reveal a ruler acutely aware of the fragility of his position. One prayer, preserved on clay tablets, pleads with the gods for relief from the plague that was destroying his people. It is a rare, human glimpse into the anxiety of a king confronted with forces beyond his control. The epidemic did not spare the royal household. Arnuwanda himself fell ill and died after only a few years on the throne. The crown then passed to his younger brother, Mursili II, who was still a young man, perhaps barely past adolescence, when he ascended the throne. Many in the court doubted his ability to rule, yet the reign of Mursili would prove to be one of the most remarkable in Hittite history. Through perseverance, intelligence, and faith, he would restore the strength of the empire and ensure its survival during one of its most perilous moments. When Mursili became king, Hatti was in disarray. The plague still ravaged the land, famine lingered, and rebellions erupted on nearly every frontier. The Kaska continued to devastate the north, threatening Hattusa itself. In the west, the kingdom of Arzawa, long a source of rivalry, had grown bold once more. In the south, discontent simmered in Syria, where the local rulers resented Hittite authority. For a young and untested monarch, it was a nearly impossible situation. Yet Mursili did not retreat or rule passively. Instead, he took command of his armies and personally led campaigns across the empire, determined to prove his legitimacy and restore order. His first task was to secure the homeland. The Kaska tribes, who had plagued the Hittites for generations, were a constant threat to the heartland. Mursili launched a series of campaigns to push them back, regaining lost territory and rebuilding fortresses along the northern frontier. These victories were not merely military, but psychological. They restored confidence in royal leadership at a time when despair and disunity threatened to undo the empire from within. Mursili also paid close attention to the spiritual health of his realm. The Hittites believed that plagues, famines, and natural disasters were signs of divine anger, punishments for broken oaths or neglected rituals. In a series of prayers and confessions preserved in the royal archives, Mursili sought to understand the cause of the plague and to appease the gods. These texts are among the most personal and introspective documents in ancient Near Eastern history. In them, Mursili speaks directly to the gods, acknowledging the sins of his father and his people, and asking for forgiveness. He confesses that Suppiluliuma's campaigns against Egypt and the capture of prisoners may have angered the deities, bringing disease as divine retribution. This religious dimension was not merely a matter of personal piety. It reflected the deep integration of religion and politics in Hittite thought. The king was not only the ruler of his people, but also the chief priest responsible for maintaining harmony between the human and divine realms. Mursili's public prayers and rituals reassured his subjects that he was fulfilling his sacred duties, even in the midst of disaster. They also reinforced his legitimacy, portraying him as a pious ruler chosen by the gods to restore balance. Once stability returned to the core of the empire, Mursili turned his attention outward. In western Anatolia, the kingdom of Arzawa posed a serious challenge. Its ruler, Uhaziti, had rebelled against Hittite authority, likely encouraged by the empire's recent weakness. Mursili responded with swift and decisive action. He led a major campaign into the west, defeating the Arzawan forces and capturing their key cities. The victory reasserted Hittite dominance over the region and secured vital trade routes leading to the Aegean. It also sent a powerful message. The empire, though shaken, was far from broken. Mursili's campaigns extended beyond the west. He also sought to restore order in Syria, where vassal states such as Nuhasi and Amuru had grown unruly. Through a combination of military force and diplomacy, he re-established Hittite control. The vassal rulers were required to renew their oaths of loyalty, swearing allegiance to the new king and the gods of Hatti. The treaties Mursili concluded during this time followed the model established by his father, but often included new clauses emphasizing mutual cooperation and divine oversight. They reveal a ruler who understood both the necessity of power and the importance of legitimacy. One of the most fascinating aspects of Mursili's reign is the contrast between his military vigor and his spiritual introspection. His annals describe campaigns and victories with the precision of a soldier, but his prayers and rituals reveal the mind of a philosopher king. He viewed history not merely as a series of battles, but as a moral drama in which divine justice played a central role. The gods rewarded righteousness and punished transgression, and it was the duty of the king to uphold moral order as much as political order. Mursili also placed great emphasis on education and record-keeping. Under his direction, the scribes of Hattusa expanded the royal archives, copying older texts and recording new ones. His reign saw the production of detailed annals that chronicled his campaigns year by year. These records, written in the clear and formal style of Hittite historical writing, offer modern historians a rare and vivid glimpse into the workings of an ancient empire. They describe not only the logistics of warfare, but also the deliberations of the royal council, the movements of envoys, and the rituals performed before and after battle. Through these annals, Mursili ensured that his reign would be remembered not only for its victories, but also for its devotion to truth and record. The final years of his reign brought renewed prosperity to the empire. Trade revived, agriculture recovered, and the plague gradually subsided. Hattusa was rebuilt and expanded, adorned with new temples and administrative buildings. The bureaucracy that had suffered during the years of plague and war was restored, and the provinces once again sent tribute and manpower to the capital. Under Mursili's leadership, Hatti regained the stature it had enjoyed under his father, but with deeper internal cohesion. Mursili's success can be attributed to a combination of personal qualities and historical circumstance. He possessed both the courage of a warrior and the patience of a statesman. He did not seek reckless expansion, but aimed instead to restore balance and order. In doing so, he exemplified the Hittite ideal of kingship, one rooted in duty, justice, and reverence for the gods. When Mursili II died, he left behind a strong and stable empire. The years of plague, rebellion, and uncertainty had been replaced by renewed prosperity and confidence. The Hittite state, disciplined and well-governed, now stood at the height of its power. Its lands stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the rich plains of northern Syria, encompassing a network of loyal vassal states and fortified cities. Into this thriving yet complex world stepped his son and successor, Muwatalli II, a king whose reign would bring the Hittite Empire into direct confrontation with Egypt in one of the most famous encounters of the ancient world. Muwatalli inherited more than a throne. He inherited a delicate balance of power. His father had reasserted Hittite dominance in Anatolia and Syria, but this success had inevitably drawn the attention of other great powers. To the south, Egypt under Pharaoh Ramesses II was determined to reclaim its lost influence in Syria. The two empires, both ambitious and expansionist, were bound to collide. The stage was set for a rivalry that would define the geopolitics of the Late Bronze Age. From the very beginning of his reign, Muwatalli faced a complex set of challenges. He had to preserve the unity of a diverse empire that included Anatolian, Hurrian, and Syrian populations, each with its own traditions and loyalties. At the same time, he had to maintain control over the empire's many vassal states, kingdoms such as Amurru and Ugarit, whose loyalty could shift under pressure from Egypt or Assyria. His rule demanded not only military strength, but also diplomatic finesse and administrative reform. One of Muwatalli's earliest and most striking decisions was to move the royal capital from Hattusa in the northern highlands to a new city further south known as Tarhuntassa. Scholars continue to debate his reasons for this relocation. Some believe it was a strategic move to place the royal court closer to the southern frontier, where conflict with Egypt was expected. Others suggest that the Kaska tribes of the north had grown too dangerous, making Hattusa vulnerable to attack. The move may also have had religious motivations. Muwatalli was a deeply devout king, and Tarhuntassa appears to have been a center for the worship of the storm god Tarhunt and the goddess Hebat, deities central to his personal piety. Whatever the cause, this relocation symbolized a shift in the center of imperial gravity, from the defensive highlands of Anatolia to the contested borderlands of Syria. The move also reflects Muwatalli's understanding of the empire as a dynamic and adaptable system. By positioning himself closer to the southern provinces, he could more effectively coordinate military campaigns, manage vassals, and negotiate with rival powers. He delegated authority in the north to trusted relatives and officials, ensuring that the heartland remained secure while he focused on the broader strategic challenges facing Hatti. At this time, Egypt under Ramesses II was pursuing its own imperial agenda. The young pharaoh, eager to prove his greatness, launched a series of campaigns aimed at reasserting Egyptian dominance over Canaan and Syria. The borderlands between Hittite and Egyptian spheres of influence, especially the region around Kadesh on the Orontes River, became the focal point of tension. Kadesh was a strategically vital city, controlling the main routes linking Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. Whoever held Kadesh could influence trade, diplomacy, and military movement across the region. Muwatalli recognized that the defense of Kadesh was essential to maintaining Hittite power in Syria. He began preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Egypt by strengthening his alliances among the Syrian vassal states. Amurru, located on the coastal corridor between Hatti and Egypt, was of particular importance. Its ruler, Bentashina, had once sided with Egypt but had since sworn allegiance to the Hittites. Keeping such allies loyal required a careful balance of reward and supervision. Muwatalli achieved this through a mixture of diplomatic marriage alliances, treaty obligations, and the ever-present threat of military force. At home, Muwatalli continued the administrative reforms begun by his predecessors. He expanded the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, ensuring that taxes, tribute, and supplies flowed efficiently to support the empire's armies. The Hittite military was now a formidable institution capable of mobilizing large forces across vast distances. Its strength lay in its organization and discipline. The chariot corps, the pride of the Hittite army, was among the best in the ancient world, employing highly trained warriors and advanced vehicles designed for mobility and power. The build-up to war with Egypt was gradual but inevitable. For years, both powers engaged in maneuvering, supporting rival factions among the Syrian city-states, exchanging envoys, and strengthening fortifications. The final spark came when Ramesses II launched a campaign northward around the year 1374 BCE, determined to capture Kadesh and break Hittite control over Syria once and for all. Muwatalli, anticipating this move, gathered his forces and marched south to meet the challenge. The resulting confrontation, the Battle of Kadesh, would become one of the most famous and well-documented battles in the ancient world. But before that great encounter, Muwatalli demonstrated remarkable skill in assembling a multinational army. His forces included not only Hittite troops, but also contingents from allied and vassal states, Carchemish, Aleppo, Kizzuwatna, and many others. These alliances were held together through personal oaths of loyalty sworn to the king and the gods of Hatti. The ability to coordinate such a diverse coalition reflects both the administrative sophistication and the diplomatic authority that the Hittite Empire had achieved under his rule. Muwatalli's preparation for war was not purely military. He also sought divine support, performing elaborate rituals to ensure the favor of the gods. In the Hittite worldview, victory was never simply a matter of strategy or strength. It depended on the will of the divine. The king, as the chief priest of the realm, was responsible for maintaining that sacred balance. His religious devotion is well attested in surviving texts, which describe his participation in major festivals and his dedication to the gods of storm, sun, and war. As Muwatalli led his armies south, he faced not only the challenge of Egypt, but also the test of leadership over a vast and culturally diverse empire. His decisions during this campaign would shape the geopolitical landscape of the Near East for generations. The battle that loomed ahead would determine not only control over Syria, but also the balance of power between the two greatest kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age. The movement of the royal court to Hattusa had given Muwatalli a logistical advantage in mobilizing troops and supplies. The city's location near the southern frontier allowed for faster communication with the Syrian provinces and easier coordination of reinforcements. From there, the king issued orders and directed preparations for one of the largest military operations ever undertaken by the Hittites. The sense of purpose and confidence that radiated from his leadership was evident in the loyalty of his generals and the unity of his allies. Yet, beyond the battlefield, Muwatalli's reign was also notable for its domestic stability. Despite the immense focus on foreign wars, he maintained order within the core of the empire. His brother, Hattusa, who would later play a decisive role in Hittite history, served as a high-ranking commander and governor in the northern regions. The cooperation between the two brothers was instrumental in keeping the Kaska tribes in check and ensuring that the empire's rear remained secure during the southern campaigns. Muwatalli's reign thus represents a delicate balance between devotion and ambition, between faith and force. He was a ruler who saw his destiny intertwined with the will of the gods, but also recognized the practical necessities of governance and war. His relocation of the capital, his diplomatic management of vassal states, and his preparations for the confrontation with Egypt all reveal a ruler who combined strategic foresight with religious conviction. In the 13th century BCE, the Hittite Empire and Egypt stood as the two dominant powers of the ancient Near East. Each commanded vast territories, formidable armies, and centuries of statecraft and tradition. Yet both also sought control over the same region, northern Syria, the land that linked Anatolia with the Levant and Mesopotamia. At its heart lay the city of Kadesh, a fortified stronghold on the Orontes River. Whoever held Kadesh controlled the trade routes, alliances, and economic lifelines of the region. The struggle for this city brought Muwatalli II of Hatti and Ramesses II of Egypt face to face in what would become one of the most famous battles in ancient history, the Battle of Kadesh. By the time the armies of the two empires met, both leaders had spent years preparing for this inevitable confrontation. Muwatalli II had consolidated Hittite power across Syria through a combination of force and diplomacy. He had reinforced his alliances with vassal kings in Carchemish, Aleppo, and Amurru, and ensured that his southern borders were guarded by loyal governors. He had also relocated his capital to Hattusa, closer to the theater of war, allowing for quicker coordination of troops and supplies. Ramesses II, on the other hand, was eager to reassert Egypt's traditional dominance over the region. His early campaigns into Canaan had brought limited success, but the control of Kadesh still eluded him. For the young pharaoh, a victory over the Hittites would not only expand Egypt's borders, but also secure his personal glory. The confrontation took place around the middle of the 13th century BCE. Ramesses led a large army divided into 4 divisions, each named after a major Egyptian deity: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. His forces advanced northward through Canaan, crossing into the territory claimed by the Hittites. Muwatalli, anticipating this advance, gathered his own coalition of forces. The Hittite army was composed not only of troops from the Anatolian heartland, but also contingents from allied and vassal states, including Carchemish, Aleppo, Kizzuwatna, and others. His coalition was diverse, reflecting the vast reach of the Hittite diplomatic network. Muwatalli's army was strategically positioned north of Kadesh, concealed behind the Orontes River. His plan relied on deception and timing. As Ramesses advanced, Hittite scouts and informants fed the Egyptians false information, convincing the pharaoh that Muwatalli's main force was still far to the north. Believing that he had time to seize Kadesh unopposed, Ramesses pushed his Amun division forward while his other divisions lagged behind, separated by miles of rough terrain. When Ramesses reached the vicinity of Kadesh and set up camp, the trap was sprung. Muwatalli ordered his chariot corps to cross the river and strike the Egyptian vanguard by surprise. The Hittite chariots, heavier and larger than those of Egypt, charged with devastating effect. Each Hittite chariot carried 3 men: a driver, a warrior armed with a spear or bow, and a shield bearer. Their sheer mass and momentum broke through the Egyptian lines, scattering the Amun division and sending the pharaoh's camp into chaos. Ramesses himself narrowly avoided disaster. According to Egyptian inscriptions, he personally rallied his troops, calling upon the god Amun for strength and leading a counterattack that turned the tide. The arrival of the Ptah division later in the day helped stabilize the Egyptian position, allowing Ramesses to avoid complete defeat. The battle continued with intense fighting around the Orontes River, but neither side could achieve a decisive victory. As evening fell, both armies withdrew to their camps, exhausted and bloodied. The accounts of the battle that have come down to us are primarily Egyptian, recorded in monumental inscriptions such as the Poem of Pentor and the Bulletin of Kadesh, carved on temple walls at Abu Simbel, Luxor, and Karnak. These texts present Ramesses as a heroic conqueror who single-handedly turned the tide of battle through divine favor and personal courage. Yet, when read critically and compared with Hittite records, it becomes clear that the Egyptian narrative was as much political propaganda as historical truth. In reality, the Battle of Kadesh ended in a stalemate. The Egyptians failed to capture the city, while the Hittites successfully defended their territory and maintained control over northern Syria. From the Hittite perspective, Muwatalli's strategy had succeeded. His deception had lured the Egyptian army into an ambush, and despite Egypt's claims of victory, Kadesh remained firmly under Hittite control. The pharaoh's retreat southward left the balance of power unchanged, though both sides would claim success for their own purposes. The battle was not a crushing defeat for either power, but it was a profound demonstration of the limits of imperial ambition. Both empires had reached the point where further expansion could only be achieved at great cost. In the aftermath of the battle, Muwatalli consolidated his hold on the region. He reaffirmed his authority over the Syrian vassal states and strengthened the Hittite garrisons along the Orontes. The city of Kadesh remained part of the Hittite sphere, and the surrounding territories continued to serve as buffer zones between the two great empires. Muwatalli also managed to maintain the loyalty of his allies despite the enormous strain that the campaign had placed on them. His political skill was evident in the way he balanced the demands of local rulers, rewarding loyalty with privileges while swiftly suppressing any hint of rebellion. The significance of the Battle of Kadesh extended far beyond the battlefield. It marked the first known instance in history where detailed accounts from both sides have survived, allowing modern historians to reconstruct the event with remarkable clarity. It also illustrates the sophistication of late Bronze Age warfare, where strategy, intelligence, logistics, and diplomacy were as important as brute strength. Muwatalli's use of deception and coalition warfare exemplified the Hittite mastery of combined political and military tactics. The battle also had a lasting impact on the internal politics of Hatti. In the years following Kadesh, Muwatalli focused on consolidating his southern territories, particularly the regions around Hattusa and northern Syria. To ensure stability in the north, he entrusted key responsibilities to his brother, Hattusili, who governed the northern provinces and commanded the armies defending the homeland against the Kaska tribes. This delegation of authority, while effective in the short term, would later have profound consequences for the Hittite dynasty. Muwatalli's reign reveals a ruler of complexity and vision. He was not only a warrior, but also a diplomat and religious reformer. He strengthened the cult of the storm god and the goddess Hebat, integrating Hurrian elements into Hittite religion in ways that reflected the cultural diversity of his empire. His decision to establish Hattusa as a new royal and religious center demonstrates both his pragmatism and his deep sense of devotion. The city, built with temples and palaces dedicated to the gods, symbolized a renewal of divine favor for Hatti. Though the Battle of Kadesh did not produce a decisive victor, it marked the beginning of a new phase in Hittite-Egyptian relations. Both powers, recognizing the futility of continued large-scale warfare, gradually shifted toward diplomacy and mutual accommodation. Over time, this would culminate in one of the earliest known peace treaties in history, a document that formalized coexistence between the two empires. For the Hittites, the outcome of Kadesh affirmed their position as a great power equal to Egypt. The empire's borders were secure, its administration strong, and its international prestige unmatched. Muwatalli's reign had proven that Hatti could confront Egypt on equal terms and hold its own. Yet beneath the surface of stability, tensions lingered. The delegation of authority to his brother Hattusili planted the seeds of a future power struggle that would reshape the royal house after Muwatalli's death. The reign of Muwatalli II had secured the Hittite Empire's place as one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age. His victory at Kadesh in holding back Egypt, his consolidation of power in Syria, and his reforms within the empire had all strengthened Hatti's foundations. Yet his decisions, particularly the relocation of the royal capital to Hattusa and his delegation of authority to his brother Hattusili, would have lasting and unexpected consequences. When Muwatalli died, the careful balance of power he had maintained between the royal family, the priesthood, and the provincial governors began to unravel. From that turmoil emerged one of the most capable yet controversial figures in Hittite history, Hattusili III, the brother of Muwatalli, and a man whose ambition would reshape the destiny of the empire. Hattusili was a soldier, administrator, and diplomat, but above all, he was a survivor. During Muwatalli's reign, he had governed the northern regions of the empire, commanding the armies that defended the homeland from the Kaska tribes. This position gave him both military experience and a base of loyal troops. It also placed him in charge of Hattusa, the old royal capital which had been largely abandoned when Muwatalli moved the court to Tarhuntasa. Under Hattusili's supervision, Hattusa began to recover its former prominence, and the northern frontier grew more secure. When Muwatalli died, the throne passed not to Hattusili, but to Muwatalli's son, Urhi-Tishub, who took the royal name Mursili III. This succession was in accordance with royal tradition, but it soon led to conflict. The new king was young and inexperienced, and he inherited an empire that was both vast and fragile. Egypt remained a rival to the south. The Assyrians were rising in the east, and the vassal states of Syria required constant management. Within the court itself, factions loyal to different branches of the royal family competed for influence. Hattusili, though outwardly loyal to his nephew, quickly found himself at odds with the new king. The tension between them centered not only on personal ambition, but also on differing visions of how the empire should be governed. Mursili III continued his father's policy of ruling from Tarhuntasa, maintaining the southern capital as the seat of royal authority. Hattusili, by contrast, favored a return to Hattusa, the traditional heart of the kingdom and the symbol of Hittite identity. To Hattusili, the move south had distanced the monarchy from its roots, weakening the unity between the royal court and the ancestral gods of the land. He believed that Hattusa was the rightful capital, sanctified by centuries of divine favor and the seat of the empire's enduring power. At first, Hattusili acted as a loyal servant. He continued to govern the north and defend the frontiers, even as his nephew attempted to assert greater control. But relations between the two men deteriorated rapidly. Mursili III began removing Hattusili's allies from positions of power and stripping him of his command. Eventually, the young king attempted to dismiss him from his northern governorship altogether, a decision that would ignite a civil war. Hattusili refused to submit. Drawing upon his network of supporters, he declared his rebellion in the name of divine justice. In his later writings, particularly in the document known as the Apology of Hattusili, he portrays himself not as an ambitious usurper, but as a man chosen by the gods to restore order and righteousness to the kingdom. He claimed that the goddess Ishtar of Samuha, whom he had served devoutly throughout his life, had commanded him to act. The Apology is both a political manifesto and a work of theology, offering insight into how Hittite kings justified their actions through divine mandate. The civil war that followed was swift but decisive. Hattusili's experience as a commander and his control of the northern armies gave him a clear advantage. He marched south with his troops, confronting the forces loyal to Mursili III. The young king, unable to muster sufficient support, was defeated and deposed. Hattusili spared his life but exiled him, possibly to the city of Nuhasa or to Syria, where he could no longer threaten the throne. This act of mercy, recorded in Hittite texts, was likely a calculated gesture to present his seizure of power as legitimate and divinely sanctioned rather than purely violent. With his victory secured, Hattusili III restored Hattusa as the royal capital. This decision carried immense symbolic weight. The return of the court to the ancestral seat of power signified continuity with the early kings and reaffirmed the unity of the empire under divine favor. Hattusili invested heavily in rebuilding the city, expanding its fortifications, temples, and palaces. Under his reign, Hattusa reached its peak as an imperial capital, a vast complex of administrative, religious, and ceremonial buildings that reflected the grandeur of the Hittite state. Hattusili's reign was defined by both reconciliation and reform. Recognizing the danger of internal division, he sought to stabilize the realm through a combination of diplomacy, law, and religious renewal. One of his first acts was to reaffirm loyalty among his vassal states. He issued new treaties that clarified the obligations of subordinate kings, emphasizing mutual protection and the sanctity of oaths sworn before the gods. He also restructured the empire's administrative system, ensuring that power was more evenly distributed among trusted officials and members of the royal family. Religion, as always in Hittite politics, was at the core of his legitimacy. Hattusili credited the goddess Ishtar of Samuha and the storm god of Nerik for his rise to power. He sponsored temple construction and organized grand festivals to honor these deities. His queen, Puduhepa, played a crucial role in this religious and political revival. A former priestess from Kizuwatna, she was both a powerful partner and a diplomatic ally. Together, they redefined the image of kingship in Hatti, not merely as military command, but as a sacred partnership between the ruler, his consort, and the divine order. Puduhepa's influence extended beyond religion into the realm of diplomacy. Her intelligence and political acumen made her a respected figure in foreign courts. She corresponded directly with foreign rulers, including the Pharaoh of Egypt, and her seal appears on official documents alongside that of her husband. The partnership between Hattusili and Puduhepa stands out in the ancient world as one of mutual respect and shared authority. Externally, Hattusili faced the task of managing the delicate balance of power established after the Battle of Kadesh. Egypt under Ramesses II remained a formidable rival, but both sides had grown weary of conflict. The Hittites faced new threats from the rising Assyrian kingdom to the east, while Egypt struggled with its own internal and external challenges. Recognizing the futility of endless warfare, Hattusili sought a diplomatic resolution that would secure peace and stability for both empires. His efforts would culminate in one of the most remarkable achievements of the Late Bronze Age, the world's first known international peace treaty, which will be explored in the next section. Domestically, Hattusili's rule brought renewed prosperity. Trade flourished once again along the routes connecting Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. The empire's administrative machinery operated efficiently, maintaining order across a vast and diverse territory. The archives of Hattusa from this period reveal a thriving bureaucratic culture, with scribes recording everything from royal decrees to inventories of livestock and grain. The legal and diplomatic traditions established under Hattusili would endure long after his death. Yet his reign was not without controversy. His seizure of the throne, though justified in his own writings, likely left lingering resentment among some factions. The exile of Mursili III created a permanent scar in the royal lineage, and later generations would debate the legitimacy of Hattusili's rule. Nevertheless, his ability to restore unity and stability after a time of civil war stands as a testament to his political skill and statesmanship. By the middle of the 13th century BCE, after decades of conflict, two of the ancient world's greatest powers stood at a crossroads. On one side was the Hittite Empire under King Hattusili III, a state now unified, disciplined, and governed by law after years of internal strife. On the other stood Egypt, ruled by Pharaoh Ramesses II, a ruler of immense ambition who had spent much of his reign defending and glorifying his empire. The memory of their armies clashing at Kadesh still lingered, but both monarchs understood that endless war could yield no true victory. The time had come for a new approach, one that would redefine international relations for centuries to come. The path to peace between Egypt and Hatti was not straightforward. Although open warfare had ceased after the indecisive Battle of Kadesh, tension and mistrust persisted for years. The Syrian frontier remained contested, and border cities frequently changed hands through rebellion or intrigue. Both empires faced new external challenges. For Egypt, growing instability in Canaan and the demands of temple building and administration. For the Hittites, the expansion of Assyria to the east and the need to maintain control over distant vassal states. These pressures gradually pushed both sides toward negotiation rather than confrontation. Hattusili III, despite the questionable origins of his rule, had proved to be a pragmatic and far-sighted leader. Having seized power from his nephew, he could not afford the risks of a new war with Egypt, which might expose internal divisions. Ramesses II, though proud of his military reputation, also saw the advantage of stability. His long reign demanded peace to sustain Egypt's economy, workforce, and monumental construction projects. In a sense, both men were driven by necessity as much as diplomacy. The first contacts between Hatti and Egypt after Kadesh were tentative. Envoys exchanged letters, testing each other's sincerity. The surviving correspondence, preserved in the royal archives of both kingdoms, reveals a tone of cautious courtesy. Ramesses addressed Hattusili as the Great King of Hatti, acknowledging his equal status, a significant diplomatic gesture as Egypt rarely treated foreign rulers as peers. Hattusili, in turn, referred to Ramesses as my brother, a title reserved in Near Eastern diplomacy for rulers of equal rank. These linguistic courtesies were more than mere politeness. They reflected the delicate balance of power that had developed between the two empires. Formal negotiations likely began through intermediaries and scribes conducted in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the late Bronze Age. Each side sought terms that would secure its interests without appearing to yield too much. For Hatti, the goal was to guarantee control over northern Syria, especially the region around Kadesh and Amuru. For Egypt, it was essential to protect its southern Levantine possessions and to ensure that Hittite interference would cease. Both sides also desired mutual assurance against external threats, particularly from the rising Assyrian kingdom, whose growing power posed a danger to both. The result of these complex discussions was the Treaty of Kadesh, concluded around the middle of the 13th century BCE, often regarded as the earliest known example of a formal peace agreement between states. The document survives in multiple versions, one inscribed in hieroglyphs on the walls of Egyptian temples, such as at Karnak in Thebes, and another written in cuneiform on clay tablets discovered at Hattusa. The two versions are nearly identical, differing only in the order of names and the languages used. This symmetry symbolizes the equality that both sides sought to project. The treaty opens with a preamble listing the titles of both rulers: Hattusili, Great King, King of Hatti, and Ramesses, Great King, King of Egypt. It declares that the two kings have chosen to end their enmity and establish peace and fraternity between their nations. What follows is a series of clauses that set out their mutual obligations in remarkable detail. The central provision of the treaty is the declaration of perpetual peace and alliance between Egypt and Hatti. It states that neither king shall attack the other's land or permit enemies to pass through their territory to cause harm. This clause was not merely symbolic. It established the principle of mutual respect for sovereignty, a concept that would later form the basis of international diplomacy. Another significant section deals with mutual defense. If either empire were attacked by a third party, the other promised to come to its aid. This alliance transformed former enemies into potential military partners, bound by a common interest in stability. Given the growing threat from Assyria, this clause held particular importance for Hattusili, whose eastern provinces were increasingly vulnerable. The treaty also addresses the issue of fugitives and political refugees, a recurring concern in ancient diplomacy. It stipulates that individuals fleeing from one country to the other must be returned, and that neither side should harbor rebels or defectors. However, the language used in this clause is strikingly humane. It requires that fugitives be returned without harm, a rare expression of concern for human treatment in a political document of this era. What makes the Treaty of Kadesh truly remarkable is not only its content, but also its tone. It is framed not as a submission of one side to another, but as a partnership between equals, united by divine witness. The gods of both Egypt and Hatti are invoked as guarantors of the agreement, ensuring its sanctity. In the Egyptian version, deities such as Ra, Seth, and Ptah are called upon, while the Hittite text names the storm god of Hatti, the sun goddess of Arina, and a host of other deities. This inclusion of multiple pantheons reflects the pluralistic and inclusive religious worldview of the time. Following the formal clauses, the treaty concludes with a section of blessings and curses, a standard feature in ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. If the kings and their descendants honor the terms of the agreement, the gods will grant them prosperity, peace, and long life. But if they break the treaty, the gods will bring ruin upon them and their lands. These ritualized assurances underscore the sacred nature of the pact. In the Hittite worldview, breaking an oath sworn before the gods was not only a political crime, but also a cosmic offense that could bring disaster upon the entire realm. The signing of the treaty marked a turning point in the history of both empires. For the Hittites, it secured their southern frontier and allowed them to focus on the growing threat from Assyria and on internal development. For Egypt, it guaranteed peace in the north and opened the way for renewed trade and diplomacy. The alliance was later strengthened by a dynastic marriage. One of Hattusili's daughters was sent to Egypt to marry Ramesses II, symbolizing the union of the two royal houses. This marriage, recorded in Egyptian inscriptions, was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy and divine will. The relationship between Hatti and Egypt flourished in the decades that followed. Letters exchanged between Hattusili, Queen Puduhepa, and the Egyptian court reveal mutual respect and even warmth. In one famous letter, Puduhepa writes directly to Ramesses, addressing him as "my brother" and "my son-in-law." She speaks candidly of political matters, temple construction, and even requests for medical remedies, evidence of the high level of trust and cooperation that the treaty had fostered. Economically, the peace brought tangible benefits. Trade routes between Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt reopened, allowing the exchange of metals, grain, and luxury goods. Caravans once again moved safely through the Levant, and merchants carried Hittite silver, Anatolian timber, and Egyptian gold across the region. The peace not only stabilized politics but also revitalized commerce and culture, strengthening the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age. Culturally and historically, the treaty's significance extends far beyond its immediate context. It represents the earliest known written example of a peace agreement based on mutual recognition and legal equality between sovereign states. Modern scholars often cite it as a forerunner of international law. Its clauses on extradition, alliance, and divine witness anticipate later concepts of diplomacy, while its emphasis on equality and cooperation marks a departure from the language of conquest and subjugation typical of earlier ages. The legacy of the Treaty of Kadesh endured long after the empires of Hatti and Egypt had vanished. Its principles of balance, negotiation, and respect for sovereignty would echo throughout history, influencing later civilizations. In the modern era, replicas of the treaty have been displayed in institutions such as the United Nations headquarters as symbols of peace and diplomacy. For Hattusili III, the treaty was the crowning achievement of his reign. It confirmed his legitimacy as king, ended the last vestiges of hostility with Egypt, and secured his empire's position in the international order of the Late Bronze Age. For Ramesses II, it was both a political triumph and a personal vindication, an acknowledgement that Egypt had faced a rival of equal stature and had found a lasting peace through negotiation rather than conquest. When Hattusili III died, the Hittite Empire stood at its greatest extent and influence. His reign, marked by stability, diplomacy, and the historic peace with Egypt, had ushered in a golden age for Hatti. Yet beneath the surface of this success lay growing strains, economic, environmental, and political, that would soon test the resilience of the empire. Into this complex world stepped Tudhaliya IV, the son of Hattusili and Queen Puduhepa. Intelligent, energetic, and deeply religious, Tudhaliya inherited not only the throne of a great empire but also the immense burden of maintaining it in a time of changing fortunes. His reign represents both the peak of Hittite imperial achievement and the beginning of the long decline that would eventually consume the Bronze Age world. Tudhaliya IV was well prepared for kingship. He had been carefully educated under the supervision of his parents, both of whom played crucial roles in shaping the intellectual and moral tone of the royal court. His mother, Puduhepa, remained an influential presence throughout his reign. Her wisdom, diplomacy, and religious devotion continued to guide the kingdom's policies, and her correspondence with foreign rulers shows that she acted almost as a co-sovereign. In a letter addressed to the pharaoh Ramesses II, she refers to Tudhaliya as "my son, the great king," and to herself as "your sister," emphasizing the enduring alliance between Hatti and Egypt that she and Hattusili had secured. At the beginning of Tudhaliya's reign, the empire was prosperous. Trade routes stretched from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, linking Hittite merchants with markets across the Near East. Tribute flowed from vassal states in Syria, and the peace with Egypt allowed resources to be directed toward infrastructure, temple construction, and the expansion of the capital. Hattusa grew larger and more magnificent than ever before. Massive new fortifications encircled the city, while monumental gates, such as the Lion Gate and the King's Gate, proclaimed the empire's power. Within the walls, palaces, archives, and sanctuaries testified to the administrative sophistication and religious fervor of the Hittite state. Religion played a particularly prominent role under Tudhaliya IV. Like his predecessors, he viewed his kingship as divinely ordained, but he seems to have taken this sense of sacred duty to an even greater extreme. His reign is marked by an extraordinary number of religious reforms and temple constructions. He undertook an ambitious program to codify and unify the vast Hittite pantheon, a complex blend of Hittite, Hurrian, and Luwian deities, into a more coherent system. This effort reflected not only his personal piety, but also a political goal: to strengthen the cultural unity of the empire by harmonizing its diverse religious traditions. One of his most significant religious projects was the development of the sacred site at Yazilikaya, near Hattusa. There, on the walls of a natural rock sanctuary, sculptors carved long processions of gods and goddesses, culminating in the depiction of the chief deities, the storm god Teshub and the sun goddess Hebat, meeting in divine union. Tudhaliya himself appears among these reliefs, presented as a mediator between the mortal and divine realms. The sanctuary at Yazilikaya remains one of the most striking monuments of Hittite religious art, and a vivid expression of Tudhaliya's theological vision, that the stability of the world depended on harmony between gods, king, and people. Yet, even as the empire flourished culturally and religiously, new pressures began to emerge. The late 13th century BCE was a time of growing instability across the Near East. Climatic changes, including prolonged droughts, appear to have caused widespread crop failures. The Hittite heartland, dependent on grain imports from Syria and the coastal regions, suffered from food shortages. In one surviving letter, Tudhaliya appeals to the pharaoh of Egypt for shipments of grain to relieve famine in his land. A poignant reminder of how fragile even the mightiest empire could become in the face of environmental change. Economic difficulties were compounded by rising external threats. To the east, Assyria had re-emerged as an aggressive and expansionist power under kings such as Adad-nirari and Shalmaneser. The Assyrians began to encroach on former Hittite territories in northern Syria, challenging Hittite control over vital trade centers such as Carchemish. To the west, the Arzawan lands and the coastal regions of western Anatolia remained restless, their allegiance uncertain. To the north, the Kaska tribes, those perennial enemies of the Hittites, continued to raid the borderlands. Tudhaliya's reign was thus one of constant vigilance, as the empire faced threats on nearly every frontier. Despite these challenges, Tudhaliya proved to be an active and capable ruler. He led several major military campaigns to secure the empire's borders. In the west, he fought against the kingdom of Asua and other rebellious states along the Aegean coast, reasserting Hittite influence over regions that had grown increasingly independent. In the south, he campaigned against Tarhuntassa, a semi-autonomous region that had been granted to a relative of the royal family but had begun to act independently. These wars were costly, but they demonstrated the king's determination to maintain unity and order within his realm. Tudhaliya also undertook a significant reorganization of the empire's administration. Recognizing that the vast territories of Hatti could not be managed solely from the capital, he expanded the system of viceroyalties first established by Suppiluliuma the First. Members of the royal family or trusted nobles were appointed as viceroys in key provinces such as Carchemish, Aleppo, and Hattusa. These viceroys acted as semi-independent governors, managing local affairs while remaining loyal to the central government. This system allowed the Hittites to exercise indirect control over distant regions while preserving their autonomy. Relations with Egypt during Tudhaliya's reign remained peaceful, continuing the alliance forged by his father. The correspondence between the two courts reflects mutual respect and cooperation. The exchange of gifts, including fine horses, metals, and textiles, reinforced diplomatic ties. The marriage between Rameses II and a Hittite princess, likely Tudhaliya's sister, had created a bond of kinship that further stabilized relations between the two powers. For the first time in generations, the Hittite southern frontier remained secure. However, peace with Egypt could not shield the empire from the larger forces that were beginning to reshape the late Bronze Age world. The combination of environmental stress, internal discontent, and external pressure gradually eroded the stability that Hattusa and Tudhaliya had built. The grain shortages caused by drought strained the economy and may have led to social unrest. In some regions, especially along the western coast, signs of population movement and migration began to appear. The later inscriptions of Tudhaliya hint at growing anxiety about disorder and divine displeasure, suggesting that the king himself sensed the fragility of the order he was trying to preserve. One of the more troubling signs of decline was the increasing difficulty of maintaining loyalty among vassal states. The once stable relationships established through treaties and oaths were breaking down as local rulers sought greater independence or turned to Assyria for protection. The Hittite diplomatic network, so carefully maintained for centuries, was beginning to fray. Even the royal family was not immune to division. Toward the end of Tudhaliya's reign, tensions emerged between the king and his relatives who governed key provinces. These internal rivalries would later contribute to the empire's fragmentation. Despite these growing challenges, Tudhaliya IV's reign remains one of remarkable cultural vitality. The art and architecture of this period reached new heights of sophistication. The temples and reliefs of Hattusa, Yazilakaya, and Alaka-Hoyuk reflect not only technical mastery, but also the cosmopolitan spirit of the empire, a fusion of Hittite, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian influences. The Hittite scribes continued to copy and preserve an extraordinary range of texts, from legal codes and treaties to myths, prayers, and hymns. It is from this period that many of the great Hittite literary works known today were recorded, preserving for posterity the spiritual and intellectual legacy of the empire. By the final decades of the 13th century BCE, the Hittite Empire stood at the edge of a precipice. For centuries, the kings of Hatti had ruled over one of the most sophisticated states of the ancient world, an empire bound together by law, religion, and diplomacy. But beneath the surface of this impressive structure, deep cracks had begun to form. The forces that would bring about the empire's downfall were not the work of a single enemy or event, but a convergence of natural disaster, economic strain, internal discord, and foreign invasion. The great unraveling that followed was not only the end of the Hittite world, but also part of a wider collapse that swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean at the dawn of the 12th century BCE. When Tudhaliya IV died, the throne passed to his son, Suppiluliuma II. His reign would be the last of the Hittite kings, whose name we know from the royal archives. Suppiluliuma inherited a realm already weakened by environmental and political pressures. Prolonged droughts had devastated agriculture, leading to repeated food shortages. The once bustling trade routes that connected Anatolia with Syria and Mesopotamia were disrupted by war and instability. The royal archives record repeated appeals for grain shipments from Egypt and Ugarit, pleas that often went unanswered. The empire's dependence on imported food had become a fatal vulnerability. As the climate worsened, famine spread across the land. Archaeological evidence from the Anatolian plateau shows layers of ash and abandonment from this period, suggesting widespread depopulation. Entire regions that had once supplied the capital with grain and livestock fell silent. Farmers abandoned their fields, and local officials could no longer collect taxes or conscript soldiers. The administrative machinery that had sustained the empire began to break down. In a letter discovered in the archives of Ugarit, a Hittite official writes despairingly of the scarcity of grain and the threat of starvation, imploring his counterpart for help. Such documents reveal the human face of the crisis, an empire not collapsing in sudden conquest, but slowly starving and fragmenting under the weight of its own complexity. At the same time, external threats multiplied. To the east, the Assyrians had grown into a formidable power. Their armies pushed westward, challenging Hittite control over northern Syria. The once loyal vassal city of Carchemish, a vital stronghold on the Euphrates, came under increasing pressure to defend itself without imperial support. To the north, the Kaska tribes, long the bane of Hittite kings, took advantage of the weakening state to raid deeper into Anatolia. Even the fortified capital at Hattusa, once considered impregnable, faced attacks. Suppiluliuma the led several campaigns against these northern invaders, but his efforts were hampered by the empire's depleted resources and manpower. A new and even more mysterious threat now appeared: the so-called Sea Peoples. These groups, whose exact origins remain debated by scholars, emerged from the regions of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, attacking coastal cities and disrupting maritime trade. They swept through the lands of Anatolia, Syria, and Canaan, leaving destruction in their wake. In Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples are described as a confederation of tribes who came from the midst of the sea, bringing with them their families, flocks, and weapons. They were not merely raiders, but migrating populations, displaced by famine, war, or environmental disaster in their own homelands. The Hittite Empire, already weakened by drought and internal fragmentation, could not withstand this combined pressure. The coastal territories that had supplied the heartland with grain and trade goods fell one by one. Ugarit, the great port city on the Syrian coast and a longtime Hittite ally, sent desperate letters to Suppiluliuma II pleading for assistance. One letter, written by the last king of Ugarit, describes the arrival of enemy ships. "The enemy ships are coming. My cities have been set on fire. Where are your ships to defend me?" No help came. Within months, Ugarit was destroyed, its palaces burned, and its archives buried in ash. As the coastal cities fell, the shockwaves reached the Anatolian interior. Trade collapsed, cutting off the empire's lifelines of metal, timber, and food. The economy, once supported by an intricate system of redistribution through royal and temple institutions, disintegrated. Without trade, the Hittite state could no longer sustain its bureaucracy or pay its soldiers. Local governors, isolated from the central government, began to act independently, governing their territories as miniature kingdoms. The unity that had once defined the empire dissolved into regional autonomy. Suppiluliuma II attempted to resist the tide. Inscriptions found near the coast of western Anatolia record naval engagements in which the Hittite fleet fought against enemy ships, one of the earliest references to naval warfare in recorded history. These battles demonstrate that even in its final years, the empire retained the capacity for organized military action. But the victories, if they occurred at all, were fleeting. The enemy forces were too numerous, the empire too weakened. The struggle was not one of conquest and defense, but of slow exhaustion. Internal instability further hastened the collapse. Famine and fear eroded the authority of the crown. In the capital, discontent grew among officials and priests who blamed the king for failing to appease the gods. Religious rituals multiplied as the court sought to restore divine favor. Offerings were made, festivals renewed, and prayers recited, yet the disasters continued. In the Hittite worldview, such suffering could only mean that the balance between the divine and human realms had been broken. The king, as chief priest, bore the ultimate responsibility for restoring that harmony. But as crops failed and cities fell, faith in royal power began to falter. Hattusa itself, the symbolic heart of the empire, became increasingly isolated. Archaeological evidence indicates that the city was eventually abandoned and burned, though whether by invaders, rebels, or its own inhabitants remains uncertain. The once grand palaces and temples were reduced to ruins. The archives, those vast collections of clay tablets that had preserved the memory of centuries, were left behind, buried in the ash and rubble that would one day preserve them for rediscovery. The collapse of the Hittite Empire was part of a larger catastrophe that engulfed much of the eastern Mediterranean world at the end of the Bronze Age. Within a few decades, nearly every major kingdom of the region, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, and the Canaanite city-states, had fallen. Trade networks that had linked Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia for centuries disintegrated. Populations were displaced, and new peoples, such as the Phrygians in Anatolia and the Aramaeans in Syria, emerged to fill the void. The great palatial economies of the Bronze Age gave way to smaller, localized societies. Writing disappeared from many regions for centuries, marking the beginning of what historians later called the Dark Age. For the Hittites, this transformation meant the end of their empire, but not the end of their culture. As the central government collapsed, groups of Hittite-speaking people migrated south and east, settling in the cities of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. These successor states, known today as the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, preserved many elements of Hittite language, art, and religion. Cities such as Carchemish, Melid, and Aleppo continued to worship the old gods and carve inscriptions in hieroglyphic script. Though they would never again wield the power of the imperial capital, they carried forward the memory of Hatti for centuries to come. The fall of the Hittite Empire remains one of the most profound turning points in ancient history. Its causes are complex and intertwined: climate change, famine, rebellion, migration, and the relentless pressure of foreign invasion. No single factor alone destroyed Hatti. Rather, it was the simultaneous failure of multiple systems that had sustained it for centuries. The intricate web of trade and diplomacy that once linked the great powers of the late Bronze Age unraveled, leaving behind a world of fragmentation and isolation. When the fires of Hattusa burned out and its palaces lay in ruins, the empire of the Hittites was no more. The city that had once been the heart of one of the greatest powers of the ancient Near East stood silent, its temples abandoned, and its royal archives buried beneath layers of ash. Yet, the fall of the capital did not mean the extinction of the Hittite people or their culture. Across the southern and eastern reaches of Anatolia and into northern Syria, the legacy of Hatti endured in a series of successor states that carried on the language, art, and traditions of the fallen empire. This new chapter in Hittite history, the age of the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, would last for centuries, preserving the memory of a civilization long after its imperial might had vanished. In the aftermath of the collapse, central Anatolia descended into political fragmentation. The once unified provinces of the Hittite state became isolated enclaves, ruled by local leaders or surviving members of the royal and administrative elite. The devastation of the heartland, caused by famine, invasion, and depopulation, forced many communities to migrate southward toward regions that had been less affected by the widespread destruction. The fertile valleys of Cilicia and the northern plains of Syria offered refuge and the possibility of renewal. There, amid the ruins of the late Bronze Age world, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms emerged. The largest and most influential of these new states was Carchemish, located on the upper Euphrates. Once a major Hittite administrative center and the seat of a royal viceroy, Carchemish became the natural heir to the empire's political and cultural traditions. The city had survived the collapse relatively intact, perhaps protected by its fortifications and distance from the northern invasions. Under the leadership of local dynasts, possibly descendants of the old Hittite royal line. Carchemish maintained continuity with the past. Its rulers bore Hittite names, used Hittite titles, and continued to invoke the gods of the old empire in their inscriptions. Carchemish became the nucleus of a network of smaller Hittite-descended states that extended across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. Among these were Melid, modern Malatya, Kumu, later Commagene, Gurgum, around modern Kahramanmaraş, Sam'al in the Amanus region, and the cities of Aleppo and Hama. Each of these polities possessed its own local dynasty, army, and religious traditions, yet all shared a common cultural foundation inherited from the empire of Hatti. They built temples to the same deities, the storm god Tarhuna, the sun goddess of Arina, and the weather gods of the mountains, and used the same hieroglyphic writing system that had developed during the late Bronze Age. The language of administration in these kingdoms was a direct descendant of Imperial Hittite, written not in cuneiform but in hieroglyphic Luwian, a pictorial script that had already been in use during the empire's final centuries. These inscriptions, carved on stone monuments and city gates, proclaimed the deeds of kings, celebrated religious rituals, and recorded treaties and dedications. The art that accompanied these inscriptions shows remarkable continuity with Hittite imperial style. Scenes of royal processions, banquets, chariot warfare, and offerings to the gods continued to adorn palace walls and city gates. However, the political landscape of the Neo-Hittite world was very different from that of the Great Empire. Instead of a single centralized state, the region was now divided into a mosaic of small, often competing principalities. Their rulers styled themselves as great kings, echoing the titles of their imperial ancestors, but their authority rarely extended beyond their immediate territories. Alliances were fluid, and conflicts among these city-states were frequent. Yet, despite their rivalries, they shared a sense of shared heritage, an awareness that they were the cultural heirs of Hatti. In Carchemish, the ruling dynasty played a particularly important role in preserving this legacy. The city's kings commissioned monumental reliefs that celebrated their divine right to rule and their connection to the Hittite gods. One of the best preserved inscriptions from Carchemish belongs to King Kuzi Teshub, who explicitly traced his lineage back to the viceroys of the imperial period. His titles and iconography reveal how consciously the Neo-Hittite rulers sought to maintain continuity with the imperial past, even as the political reality around them had changed beyond recognition. The survival of Hittite traditions in these successor states was not merely symbolic. It was also practical. The administrative and legal systems developed under the empire continued to influence local governance. Treaties, contracts, and laws still followed the Hittite model, emphasizing loyalty oaths, divine witnesses, and compensation rather than retribution. The temples of these cities functioned as centers of both religion and economy, managing land, labor, and trade. Priests and scribes, the custodians of literacy and ritual, ensured that the memory of the old ways did not disappear. Religion remained at the core of Neo-Hittite identity. The storm god Tarhuna, often depicted wielding a thunderbolt and standing on a mountain or a bull, retained his position as chief deity. In many inscriptions, local rulers refer to themselves as beloved of the storm god, echoing the divine kingship ideology of their imperial predecessors. Temples dedicated to the storm god, the sun goddess, and other members of the Hittite pantheon continued to serve as centers of worship and political legitimacy. Over time, these traditions blended with those of neighboring cultures, particularly the Aramaeans, whose influence grew steadily in Syria during this period. Indeed, one of the defining features of the Neo-Hittite age was cultural hybridity. The borders between Anatolia and Syria became zones of interaction between Hittite, Aramaean, Phoenician, and Assyrian influences. Art and language reflected this fusion. Inscriptions often combined hieroglyphic Luwian with Aramaic, and artistic motifs blended Hittite and Mesopotamian styles. This cultural synthesis gave rise to a vibrant and distinctive regional identity. one that preserved the essence of Hittite civilization while adapting to a new political and linguistic environment. As the centuries passed, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms came increasingly under the shadow of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire, which had survived the Bronze Age collapse and re-emerged as a powerful force in Mesopotamia, began to expand westward. Its kings sought to control the trade routes and resources of Syria and Anatolia. The Hittite successor states, divided and weakened by internal rivalries, were gradually drawn into the orbit of Assyria's imperial ambitions. The first major Assyrian incursions into Neo-Hittite territory occurred during the reign of King Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BCE. He campaigned through the lands of the Euphrates and demanded tribute from local rulers. Some submitted willingly, recognizing the futility of resistance, while others rebelled and were crushed. The inscriptions of the Assyrian kings proudly list the names of Neo-Hittite cities brought under their control, Carchemish, Melid, Kumu, and Gurgum among them. The once proud descendants of Hatti now found themselves vassals to a new empire rising from the east. Despite the encroachment of Assyria, the Neo-Hittite culture persisted. Even as they paid tribute to their conquerors, local kings continued to build temples, carve reliefs, and inscribe monuments in their own languages. The art of this period displays a remarkable vitality, with intricate stone carvings depicting feasts, rituals, and scenes of divine blessing. These works show how the Hittite artistic tradition evolved under foreign rule, absorbing new motifs while retaining its distinct symbolic vocabulary. By the 8th century BCE, however, the independence of the Neo-Hittite states was nearing its end. The Assyrian Empire, under rulers such as Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, systematically incorporated the remaining kingdoms into its expanding dominion. Carchemish, the last great bastion of Hittite culture, fell to the Assyrians around the middle of that century. Its capture marked the final extinguishing of Hittite political autonomy, though the cultural echoes of Hatti continued to resonate in the region for generations. The disappearance of the Neo-Hittite states did not erase their influence. Their language and artistic styles shaped the emerging Aramaean and later Anatolian cultures. The hieroglyphic inscriptions left on stone monuments continued to bear witness to the endurance of Hittite literacy long after the empire's fall. In later centuries, Greek historians such as Herodotus would recall distant memories of powerful kingdoms in central Anatolia, echoes, perhaps, of the Hittites and their successors. The story of the Neo-Hittite kingdoms is one of resilience amid transformation. Though the empire of Hattusa had vanished, its people and traditions adapted to a changing world. They preserved their gods, their art, and their sense of identity through centuries of upheaval. In doing so, they bridged the gap between the great empires of the Bronze Age and the new civilizations of the Iron Age. For more than 3,000 years, the once great Hittite Empire vanished from human memory. Its capital, Hattusa, lay buried beneath layers of earth and grass, its temples silent and its archives sealed in clay. The names of its kings, Suppiluliuma, Muwatalli, Hattusili, disappeared from the records of later civilizations. Even the Bible, one of the few surviving texts to mention the Hittites, knew them only as a shadowy people of the past, their origins and achievements forgotten. For centuries, no one could have imagined that beneath the hills of central Anatolia lay the remains of one of the great powers of the ancient world. It was only through the combined efforts of explorers, archaeologists, and linguists in the 19th and 20th centuries that the lost civilization of the Hittites was finally brought back to light. The rediscovery of the Hittites began not with an archaeological expedition, but with a mystery in ancient texts. During the 18th century, scholars studying Egyptian and Mesopotamian inscriptions encountered references to a powerful kingdom called Hatti, or Keita. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses II mentioned great battles and treaties with the Keita, describing them as equals of Egypt itself. Yet, by that time, there was no known nation or people bearing that name. The mystery of who the Hittites were and where their empire had stood became one of the great historical puzzles of the 19th century. The first clues lay hidden in the heart of Anatolia. In the 1800s, European travelers exploring the Ottoman provinces of Asia Minor began reporting strange ruins and inscriptions carved in stone. In 1834, a French scholar and explorer named Charles Texier visited a remote site near the modern Turkish village of Boğazköy. There, he found the remains of massive stone walls, city gates, and scattered sculptures depicting lions and warriors. Texier was awestruck. He believed he had discovered the ancient city of Pteria mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus. He could not have known that he was standing amid the ruins of Hattusa, the long-lost capital of the Hittite Empire. For decades, the site remained a curiosity, its true identity unknown. The inscriptions carved on the stones of Boğazköy were written in an undeciphered pictorial script. Scholars speculated wildly about its origin, attributing it alternately to the Phrygians, the Assyrians, or even a lost tribe of Israel. The key to the mystery came gradually through the efforts of several pioneering archaeologists and linguists. In the 1880s, the British archaeologist William Wright and his German colleague William Ramsay identified additional inscriptions in a similar script at sites across Anatolia and northern Syria. These markings, now known as Hittite hieroglyphs, suggested the existence of a once widespread and sophisticated culture. At the same time, scholars working with Mesopotamian cuneiform texts began to recognize references to a land called Hatti and to rulers whose names did not match any known Assyrian or Babylonian kings. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align. The decisive breakthrough came at the dawn of the 20th century. In 1906, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler, working in collaboration with Theodore Macready of the Ottoman Imperial Museum, began systematic excavations at Boğazköy. What they uncovered would forever change the understanding of ancient history. Beneath the surface of the site lay the ruins of a vast city. Temples, palaces, gates, and administrative buildings, along with thousands upon thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform script. The discovery was staggering. These tablets, preserved by the same fire that had destroyed the city, formed one of the most extensive archives ever found in the ancient Near East. Winkler soon realized that he had discovered the archives of an imperial capital. The tablets included royal decrees, treaties, prayers, myths, and diplomatic correspondence written in multiple languages: Akkadian, Hattian, Hurrian, and a then unknown language that appeared to be the native tongue of the rulers of Hattusa. Among the texts was a copy of the famous peace treaty between the kings of Hatti and Egypt, confirming that this was indeed the seat of the powerful Kheta described in Egyptian inscriptions. The lost kingdom of the Hittites had finally been found. But another mystery remained: the language itself. The Hittite texts were written in cuneiform, the same script used in Mesopotamia, but the words did not correspond to any known Semitic or Sumerian language. Scholars debated its origins fiercely. Some believed it was related to Hurrian, others thought it might be a form of early Indo-European speech. The question was settled in 1915 by a Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný. While studying the Boğazköy tablets, Hrozný noticed several recurring phrases that he recognized from other Indo-European languages. One famous example was the phrase "Nu ninda an edzateni watarma ekuteni," which he translated as "Now you will eat bread and drink water." The words for bread and water, as well as the grammatical structure, clearly resembled those in Indo-European languages such as Latin and Sanskrit. With this revelation, Hrozný announced that the language of the Hittites was indeed Indo-European, the oldest known branch of that vast linguistic family. Hrozny's discovery revolutionized the study of ancient history. It proved that the Hittites were not a mysterious offshoot of the Mesopotamian world, but a distinct Indo-European people who had established a powerful civilization in Anatolia long before the rise of classical Greece or Rome. The decipherment of their language opened a new window into the Bronze Age, revealing a world of diplomacy, law, and culture that had been buried for millennia. In the decades that followed, excavations at Hattusa continued under the direction of German and Turkish archaeologists. Each new season of work expanded the understanding of Hittite society. The great temple, dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess, was uncovered with its massive storage rooms and cultic installations. The royal palace complex revealed the administrative heart of the empire, where scribes once wrote and stored their clay tablets. The city's monumental gates, adorned with carvings of lions, sphinxes, and warriors, testified to its grandeur. One of the most remarkable discoveries was the archive itself. The tens of thousands of tablets found in the ruins of Hattusa covered every aspect of Hittite life. Some contained royal annals describing the deeds of kings such as Suppiluliuma the First and Mursili II. Others preserved legal codes, treaties, and religious rituals, offering a detailed picture of Hittite governance and belief. Mythological texts revealed a rich spiritual world in which gods and humans interacted in complex ways, blending Indo-European, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian traditions. Through these writings, the Hittites emerged not merely as warriors and diplomats, but as thinkers, poets, and theologians. The rediscovery of the Hittites had profound implications for the study of the ancient Near East. It added a missing chapter to the story of civilization, bridging the worlds of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Aegean. The Hittites were revealed as cultural intermediaries, transmitting ideas, technologies, and artistic styles between East and West. Their diplomacy, embodied in the Treaty of Kadesh, showed that the concept of international law had roots far deeper than previously imagined. Their legal system, emphasizing fairness and compensation, influenced neighboring cultures. Even their mythology, with its tales of storm gods and cosmic struggle, would echo in later Anatolian and Greek traditions. Throughout the 20th century, new discoveries continued to refine this picture. Excavations at other sites, Alaka Huyuk, Yazilikaya, and Kultepe, added further layers of understanding. The sanctuary at Yazilikaya, with its procession of gods carved in stone, revealed the visual expression of Hittite theology. The merchant archives of Kultepe illuminated the economic and cultural world from which the Hittite state had first emerged. Together, these findings reconstructed an entire civilization once thought lost beyond recovery. In the modern era, the Hittites have come to be recognized as one of the foundational cultures of the ancient Near East. Their achievements in administration, diplomacy, architecture, and law stand alongside those of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Yet, their rediscovery also serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile human memory can be, and how easily even the greatest empires can vanish from history, only to be reborn through the persistence of those who seek to uncover the past. The rediscovery of the Hittite civilization in the modern age did more than fill a gap in ancient history. It reshaped our understanding of how human societies evolve, adapt, and remember. The Hittites had long vanished from the world stage, their empire consumed by fire and time. Yet their ideas and innovations continued to ripple through history in ways both visible and subtle. Their achievements in law, diplomacy, language, and religion left traces that would influence neighboring cultures and, through them, much later civilizations. To study the Hittites is to glimpse not only the grandeur of a lost Bronze Age power, but also the enduring continuity of human thought across millennia. The Hittites' most lasting contribution lies in their concept of law and justice. From the earliest days of their kingdom, they had developed a legal system that reflected a deep concern for fairness, moderation, and order. Unlike many other ancient law codes, such as the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, which imposed harsh punishments and relied heavily on the principle of retribution, the Hittite laws often favored restitution and compensation. Fines or material payments frequently replaced corporal or capital punishment. For example, if someone caused injury or damage, the law required repayment in goods or livestock rather than physical vengeance. This approach suggests a society striving for stability through balance rather than fear, an early recognition that justice could serve to restore harmony rather than inflict suffering. The Hittite legal system also demonstrated a remarkable sense of practicality and humanity. It addressed issues ranging from theft and property disputes to marriage, inheritance, and even the treatment of slaves. Women in Hittite law enjoyed greater rights than in many other contemporary societies. They could own property, initiate divorce, and engage in legal transactions. Marriage was seen not as an act of subjugation but as a contract between partners. The laws even made provisions for adopted children and the protection of widows, reflecting a social order that valued fairness and social cohesion. Such ideas would later find echoes in the legal traditions of other Near Eastern and Mediterranean civilizations. Equally influential was the Hittite approach to diplomacy. The empire's complex web of treaties and alliances set a new standard for international relations. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed between Hattusa III and Rameses II, remains the earliest known example of a formal peace accord between sovereign states. Yet the Hittites had practiced diplomatic negotiation and legalized alliance building long before that. Their archives are filled with copies of treaties with vassal kings and neighboring powers, each carefully structured and witnessed by the gods. These treaties established clear expectations, military assistance, trade agreements, and the return of fugitives, and they did so in language that combined political pragmatism with moral and religious solemnity. The Hittites saw diplomacy as an extension of divine order. Every treaty was not merely a political arrangement, but a sacred covenant, witnessed by the deities of both parties. Breaking such an agreement was not only an act of betrayal, but a sin that could bring divine retribution. This blending of law, faith, and politics foreshadowed later systems of governance in which moral authority and political legitimacy were intertwined. The modern idea that international agreements should be binding, overseen by moral or ethical principles, can trace its roots back to the Hittite understanding that peace required more than power. It required trust, sanctified by higher ideals. Their contributions to administration and governance were equally profound. The Hittite state was one of the earliest to develop a bureaucratic apparatus capable of managing a vast and diverse empire. Records from Hattusa reveal an empire administered through written correspondence, standardized taxation, and delegated authority. The viceroyalty system, in which members of the royal family ruled key provinces such as Carchemish, allowed the Hittites to maintain unity while respecting local autonomy. Their model of provincial administration, balancing central authority with regional responsibility, would later appear in various forms throughout imperial history, from Persia to Rome. The Hittite religion, too, left a legacy that outlasted their political power. Their pantheon, famously described as the 1,000 gods of Hatti, reflected both inclusiveness and adaptability. The Hittites never imposed a single rigid faith upon their subjects. Instead, they absorbed the deities and rituals of the peoples they ruled, the Hattians, Hurrians, Luwians, and others, creating a vast spiritual mosaic. This religious pluralism allowed for cultural integration across the empire, fostering unity without erasing local identity. In this respect, the Hittites anticipated the religious syncretism that would later characterize empires such as the Romans. Some of the Hittite myths and religious ideas would echo in later traditions. Their story of the storm god's battle with the dragon Illuyanka, for example, parallels the Mesopotamian myth of Marduk and Tiamat, and even the later Greek tale of Zeus and Typhon. These recurring motifs of divine combat, the triumph of order over chaos, demonstrate how Hittite mythology contributed to the shared mythological language of the ancient world. Through trade, migration, and cultural exchange, such stories traveled beyond Anatolia, blending into the collective imagination of humanity. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the Hittite legacy is linguistic. The decipherment of Hittite by Bedřich Hrozný in the early 20th century revealed it to be the earliest known Indo-European language. This discovery fundamentally altered the study of historical linguistics. Before Eurosny's breakthrough, the Indo-European family was thought to have originated primarily in Europe or the steppes of Eurasia. The Hittite texts proved that an Indo-European tongue had flourished in Anatolia more than 3,000 years ago. This insight not only expanded the known range of the language family, but also provided clues to its deep structure and origins. The study of Hittite grammar, vocabulary, and syntax has illuminated the evolution of languages such as Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and even the modern tongues of Europe and South Asia. Words and roots found in Hittite resonate across millennia. The Hittite watar for water and ezatani for eat are direct linguistic ancestors of English, Latin, and Sanskrit equivalents. Through such connections, the language of the Hittites links modern humanity to its prehistoric past, bridging the gap between ancient Anatolia and the living languages of today. Culturally, the Hittites occupy a unique position as intermediaries between East and West. Their empire stood at the crossroads of continents, absorbing influences from Mesopotamia and Syria while passing them on to the Aegean world. Their use of cuneiform and hieroglyphic scripts allowed for communication across linguistic boundaries, making them both preservers and transmitters of knowledge. The Hittites' mastery of metallurgy, particularly in ironworking, foreshadowed the technological transformation that would soon define the Iron Age. Though they did not invent ironworking, their Anatolian heartland became one of the regions where this new technology first spread. In the modern era, the rediscovery of the Hittites has also shaped the field of archaeology and the understanding of ancient statehood. The excavations at Hattusa revealed not only monumental architecture but also the workings of a complex society. The city's archives offered unprecedented insights into administration, law, and religion, making the Hittite civilization one of the best documented of the ancient world. The careful organization of these records has allowed historians to reconstruct the rhythms of everyday life, from grain rations and festival preparations to royal marriages and diplomatic correspondence. The story of the Hittites carries lessons that remain relevant in the modern world. Their rise and fall illustrate the fragility of complex systems in the face of environmental and political stress. The empire's collapse during the 12th century BCE, triggered by drought, famine, and migration, serves as an early example of how interconnected societies can unravel when natural and human pressures converge. Yet their ability to adapt and their cultural endurance, surviving through the Neo-Hittite states and later rediscovery, also remind us that civilizations rarely vanish completely. Fragments of their knowledge and spirit often persist, waiting to be revived. Today, the name Hittite no longer evokes a biblical mystery, but stands as a symbol of human resilience and rediscovery. The ruins of Hattusa rise again, not as an imperial capital, but as a monument to curiosity and scholarship. Visitors who walk through its Lion Gate and climb its ancient ramparts can still sense the grandeur of a civilization that once stood among the great powers of the world. The clay tablets recovered from its ruins now speak in clear voices, voices that had been silent for 3,000 years, but that once again tell of laws, prayers, treaties, and dreams. In the end, the legacy of the Hittites is not only in their achievements, but in their rediscovery itself. Their story reminds us that history is not static, but cyclical, that knowledge lost can be found again, that silence can give way to speech. Through the patient work of archaeologists, linguists, and historians, the Hittites have re-entered the human story they helped to shape. Their empire may have fallen, but their ideas of justice, diplomacy, and divine harmony continue to speak across time. The Hittite civilization stands today as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning of how even the greatest powers can collapse under the weight of natural and human pressures, and an inspiration in how memory, once buried, can be revived. In their rediscovery, the modern world found not just the remnants of a vanished people, but a reflection of its own search for order, meaning, and connection to the past. The story of the Hittites, reborn from ruins, endures as one of the most profound testaments to humanity's ability to remember what was once thought lost forever.